Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was on the late train from Chicago to Milwaukee, the kind that mostly empties out after 10 p.m. I took that route a lot, worked a job downtown, lived in the suburbs. The train usually wasn't too crowded that late, mostly a few tired business types or people heading home after a late shift. That night it was foggy, thick enough that the city lights looked like they were bleeding into the air. I was sitting by the window, watching the industrial area on the east side of town roll by. The old warehouses, empty lots, cracked pavement. Nothing much changed from ride to ride. But something caught my eye as we passed one particular vacant lot. There was a set of lights, row after row, just blinking on and off in a steady pattern. They weren't the usual flickering of street lamps or security lights. These were arranged so precisely it looked deliberate, like someone had lined them up in a perfect diamond shape, the points sharp, and the edges glowing just enough to stand out in the fog. I kept staring at it, trying to make sense of why there would be lights there at all. That lot was empty, fenced off, no buildings or power sources that I could see. The lights blinked rhythmically, like a slow pulse. It was mesmerizing and kind of unsettling at the same time. I didn't take my eyes off the lights when the train pulled into the next stop, a small suburban station, where only a handful of people got on and off. That's when I noticed him. He slid onto the seat across from me, like he belonged there. But he didn't look like anyone I'd ever seen on that route before. Black suit, perfectly pressed, white shirt with a stiff collar, black tie, almost like a funeral director or a government agent. His hair was dark, slicked back, and his face was sharp but pale, almost too smooth. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. It was completely blank. No writing, no logo, nothing on the cover. He slid it across the seat toward me. I blinked. "What's this?" He leaned in a little, voice low and quiet, almost a whisper. "Sketch it again. Differently." I looked at him like he was joking, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "What? Sketch what?" He didn't answer right away. The train rattled on, the fog outside thickening. I glanced back at the window, but the lights on the lot were gone. When I turned back, he was watching me, expectant. I picked up the notebook, feeling the smooth paper under my fingers. "Look, I don't draw. I'm not sure what you want me to sketch." He smiled just a little, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not what you think, just the lights, the pattern." The train grew quieter, and the few other passengers kept to themselves, earbuds in or heads down. I wasn't sure what to do, so I opened the notebook and, on the first page, drew a rough diamond shape with a pen I happened to have in my bag. It wasn't perfect, more like a kid's doodle, but the edges lined up. He watched without blinking. When I finished, he slid the notebook back toward me. "Better," he said, "but not quite right." I frowned. "How do you want it then?" He didn't say. Instead, he stood up, the train slowing as it neared the next station. "Remember," he said softly, "sketch it differently." And then he was gone, just like that, disappeared into the crowd before the train stopped. I looked down at the blank notebook in my lap, confused. For the rest of the ride, I kept glancing toward that vacant lot whenever the train passed by, but the lights never came back. The stations got emptier, the fog never lifted, and I sat there holding that notebook with nothing but my shaky drawing inside. When I got home, I tried sketching again, over and over, different shapes and angles, but nothing matched what I saw. And every time I looked up from the notebook, I felt like I was being watched, even when I was alone. After a few days, I started seeing black cars parked just outside my apartment building. No license plates, tinted windows. The drivers never got out, just sat there, like they were waiting for me to do something. I never approached, never took pictures. Something about them didn't feel normal. One night, around midnight, I opened the notebook again. The pages were all blank except for my drawings, but I swear there was a faint glow coming from the paper. Not light exactly, but something strange, like it was pulsing with the memory of those lights. I don't know why the man wanted me to sketch it differently. I don't know what that diamond of lights really was or what it meant. All I know is that after that night, nothing about those rides felt normal anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I should show the notebook to someone, maybe a friend or the police, but the thought of explaining all this sounds ridiculous. So I just keep the notebook hidden, sketching in it when I can, always trying to get the shape right, but never quite succeeding. And every time I do, the feeling of being watched gets stronger. I guess some things don't want to be understood. I worked as a night security guard at the old Silver Pines amusement park, just outside a small town in upstate New York. The place had been closed for a couple of years, but the owners kept it fenced off and paid for overnight security to keep vandals and trespassers out. I wasn't expecting much, mostly just long shifts of silence, the occasional stray raccoon, and maybe the distant hum of traffic on the highway. It was late August when things started feeling off. That night, I was making my usual rounds on foot, walking along the perimeter fence and checking the gates. The sky was clear and cool, just the kind of night where you can see stars shining bright between the tall pines. The Ferris wheel stood still and dark against the horizon, its silhouette a familiar shape that almost looked peaceful in the moonlight. I was near the Ferris wheel when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a drone or some kind of promotional light show the owners might have tested, but there was no sound and the lights weren't moving like drones usually do. Above the Ferris wheel, just barely visible, was a circular shape, a craft of some sort. It wasn't blinking or flashing like a plane, and it wasn't moving fast. It hovered silently like it was watching the park. I froze, staring up at it. The craft was perfectly round. No wings, no lights that changed or moved, just a steady glow around its edge that blended with the night sky. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a small car, but the way it held position was unnatural. I couldn't hear anything unusual, no hum or buzz, just the quiet night. I blinked, and it was gone. No flash, no noise, just gone. I checked my phone, no signal out there, and there wasn't a soul around. The whole park was silent, except for my own footsteps on the cracked pavement. I thought maybe I'd imagined it or my eyes played tricks in the dark. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but I kept glancing up at the Ferris wheel, half expecting to see the craft again. It never came back. The next evening, I arrived early, crossing the empty parking lot toward the main gate when I noticed two men walking casually through the entrance. They were dressed the same, black suits, white shirts, black ties, and shiny black shoes. Their hair was neatly combed back, and their expressions were serious but calm. They didn't look like typical visitors, but they didn't seem like vandals or troublemakers either. I greeted them as I did with anyone who showed up during the day, but they didn't respond. Instead, they nodded once, very deliberately, and then just kept walking toward the park's heart. Curious, I followed at a distance. They headed straight for the haunted house attraction, the old Midnight Manor, Des, which had been closed for years. The building was half collapsed, boarded up in places with windows broken and peeling paint. They disappeared inside, and when I looked back a minute later, they were gone. No sign of them anywhere, not even footprints or doors left open. I spent the next hour checking the entire park, calling out, walking through every accessible area. Nothing. No sign of the men. The haunted house was locked tight, no way in without heavy tools, which I didn't have. I told myself they must have slipped out the way they came or were part of some maintenance crew I hadn't heard about, but there was no evidence. After that night, things got stranger. During my shifts, I started noticing subtle changes around the park. The Ferris wheel sometimes looked like it was gently turning in the breeze, but when I got closer, the gears were still. Shadows moved differently, sometimes too fast or in ways that didn't match the shapes casting them. I'd hear faint footsteps behind me on the empty walkways, but when I turned, no one was there. Radios I carried would crackle with static, then cut out completely. Once, my flashlight flickered and went out for a full minute, even though the batteries were fresh. One night, a few days later, I saw those same two men again. They were standing near the entrance, perfectly still, watching me. I stopped walking, heart pounding, but they didn't move or acknowledge me. When I blinked, they vanished. No doors opened or closed, no footsteps. They were just gone. I never saw them leave. The more I worked those shifts, the heavier the silence felt. The park's usual creepy atmosphere wasn't just the decay or the darkness anymore. It was like something else was there, watching, waiting. I thought about quitting, but I was under contract and the pay was decent for a small town. So I kept showing up, though every night felt more tense than the last. One time, while checking the Ferris wheel base, I found strange marks on the ground. Circular indentations like the park had been pressed down by something heavy but oddly shaped. They weren't tire tracks or animal prints. I photographed them but kept them to myself. Another night, I caught a glimpse of light coming from inside the haunted house. I swore the place was empty, but the flicker was definitely there, like an old lantern or candle. I called out, but only silence answered. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing noises in the woods surrounding the park. Whispers or maybe wind, but there was a rhythm to it, like someone trying to communicate. After about a week, I saw the men one last time. This time, they were near the Ferris wheel again. One looked directly at me and said something quietly, almost inaudibly. "This place doesn't belong to you." I blinked, confused, and when I looked again, they were walking away into the trees bordering the park. I thought about following, but the night was thick and cold, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I finished my shift and went straight home. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I haven't gone back since. I keep wondering what those men wanted, what the craft over the Ferris wheel really was. I don't have answers. The whole thing feels like it was part of some bigger plan or warning I wasn't meant to understand. Sometimes when I'm driving past that area, I look toward where the park used to be and swear I can still see faint lights moving slowly in the trees or the Ferris wheel turning in the moonlight. But when I blink, it's just darkness again. I was out by the river just before dusk, hoping to get some good shots of the herons and kingfishers that come around this part of the forest in late summer. I've been a wildlife photographer for years, mostly freelance, mostly small assignments, or just personal projects. I have a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, miles from the nearest town. The river runs right behind it, wide and slow moving, and it's a good spot for catching animals coming to drink or fish passing through. That evening, the air was still and warm, and the sky was a faded orange-gray, the kind of light that's tricky but rewarding if you're patient. I was sitting on a fallen log near the water's edge, my camera on a tripod aimed toward a bend where the trees cast long shadows. I'd been shooting for maybe an hour, mostly birds landing on branches or a beaver swimming by. When I got home and started unloading the photos, I noticed something weird. In a few shots, there were these shapes in the river, like dark, irregular forms floating just beneath the surface. They didn't reflect the sky or trees, didn't look like rocks or logs. They were smooth and matte, almost like shadows but more solid, and they didn't change between frames even though the water moved around them. At first, I thought it was some trick of the light or a camera glitch, so I deleted the shots and kept going. But the next day, I went back and set up in the same spot. Same time of day, same light conditions. The shapes showed up again. I zoomed in and tried different angles, but they always seemed to be there, just below the surface, unmoving and oddly distinct. I mentioned it to a friend who joked it was river spirits or something, but I wasn't convinced. It felt more like something off. 2 nights later, I was sitting on my porch editing photos on my laptop. The woods were quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets and the slow rush of the river. My cabin is pretty remote, so I was surprised when I heard a car pull up the gravel driveway. I didn't recognize the make or model, and it was late enough that I wasn't expecting visitors. A man got out, dressed in a black suit that looked a bit out of place in this setting. No tie, but a crisp white shirt and polished shoes. He didn't knock or ring the doorbell. He just walked right up to the porch. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, but it wasn't warm. "I'm sorry to intrude. I'm interested in some photos you've taken." I wasn't sure what to say. "What kind of photos?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open, but not showing me anything. I believe you have images that capture certain anomalies in the river nearby. It would be helpful if I could review your camera's memory card. I stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable. I don't think that's necessary. He nodded as if I hadn't spoken, then took the camera off the table and slid out the SD card. I realized I hadn't even locked the door. Please put that back, I said. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned the card over in his fingers like he was weighing it. Then he said quietly, "Water keeps its own secrets. Sometimes those secrets aren't meant to be uncovered." I felt a chill, even though it wasn't cold out. "Who are you?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Just someone who wants to help you avoid trouble." I looked around. The porch light flickered, and for a moment the woods beyond looked darker than they should have been, like a shadow pressing in. When I looked back, the man was still staring at the card. I moved toward him slowly. "Give that back." Without another word, he popped the card back into my camera and handed it over. Then he turned, got back in his car, and drove off without a word. I locked the door and sat down hard, the camera still warm in my hands. I thought about calling someone, the police maybe, but there wasn't much to report besides a stranger who showed up at my remote cabin. No forced entry, no threats, just that eerie warning. The next day, I went back to the river to see if I could figure out what those shapes were. The water looked normal, clear, slow, nothing unusual. But when I raised my camera and looked through the viewfinder, I saw them again, the same shapes lurking just beneath the surface. I took some pictures and later that night tried to examine them more closely on my laptop. When I zoomed in, the shapes looked like they were made of something solid but dark. No reflection, no texture, just shapes that didn't belong in the water. After that, I started noticing other things. At night, when I went outside to check the perimeter, I'd catch glimpses of movement between the trees, always too quick to identify. Sometimes my phone would die suddenly when I tried to call or text. And the river, it sometimes made a low hum, almost like a vibration under the water, but only at dusk and only near where I'd been photographing. I didn't tell anyone except a few friends who thought I was imagining things or stressed out from being alone all the time. But I knew something had changed. The man's words stayed with me. Water keeps its own secrets. I haven't gone back to the river after dark since. The shapes are still there in the photos, always just below the surface, like silent watchers. Sometimes when the wind is still and the river moves quietly, I swear I can feel something watching me from the trees. But when I turn, there's nothing but shadows. I keep thinking about that man in black and his warning, about how some things are better left undisturbed. I'm not sure what the river is hiding, but I'm pretty sure it's not natural. I'm writing this because I want someone else to know. Maybe there's something out there paying attention to the quiet places we forget. Maybe some secrets are alive and they don't want to be found. I was driving back from a storm chase about an hour outside of Amarillo, Texas, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The sky had been wild all day, thunderheads stacking up, flashes of lightning ripping through the clouds, that heavy smell of rain and ozone in the air. I had my camera gear packed tight in the truck bed, lenses cleaned and ready for the next round. But the storm was breaking up, so I figured it was time to head home. I'm Rachel, by the way. I've been a storm photographer for years, mostly freelance, selling shots to weather sites, magazines, or just posting on my own social channels. It's not a glamorous life, mostly cold nights on a folding chair and freezing fingers, but when you catch something rare, it's worth it. That day was different. While I was setting up near a dirt road off Highway 287, I noticed something odd through my long telephoto lens. I was focusing on a particularly nasty-looking cumulonimbus that had these weird ripples along its edges, sort of like waves on water. Then out of nowhere, a small metallic shape darted through the clouds. It wasn't a plane, not a bird, and it didn't leave any trail or noise. Just this sleek, shiny object weaving effortlessly through the storm cells. I snapped a bunch of photos, adjusting focus and shutter speed, but the thing vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. When I checked the shots on my camera, the object was there, sharp and clear on the negatives. It looked like a dark disc, almost like a piece of polished metal catching the last bits of sunlight. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I set up my little darkroom in the basement, just a red bulb and some trays for developing film, and started processing the rolls. I worked slow, careful with the chemicals, because if there was anything on the negatives worth looking at, I didn't want to ruin it. As the images started to appear, I saw the storm clouds, the lightning, the rugged landscape, and then there it was again, in a few frames. That strange metallic blur twisting through the air, unlike anything I'd ever seen. I was alone, the house quiet except for the dripping faucet in the kitchen above. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open. I didn't hear anyone come down, and the stairs were behind me. So I whipped around. There he was, a man in a black suit, no tie, pale face with sharp features, standing in the red glow of the darkroom. He looked calm but serious, almost like he didn't belong in a place like this. His eyes caught the light just right, and I could see a faint reflection of the negatives in his pupils. "Can negatives lie?" he said, voice low and steady. I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" He stepped closer, hands folded in front of him, calm but deliberate. "Can a negative show something that isn't really there, something that might never have been?" I wasn't sure how to answer, so I just shook my head. He looked around the room, eyes settling on the contact sheets pinned to the wall. "You've captured something," he said, "something that people aren't meant to see." My stomach tightened. "Who are you?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone who makes sure certain images don't spread." His voice was polite but had an edge, like he was used to being obeyed without question. I felt trapped, but I couldn't let him take the film. I swallowed hard and said, "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. It had no logo or company name, just black text on a white background. I couldn't read it clearly in the dim red light. "We keep things quiet," he said. "You won't be bothered if you agree to destroy those negatives." My heart pounded. I wanted to say no, to demand answers, but something about him, his calm certainty, made me hesitate. Before I could reply, I heard my phone buzz upstairs. It was a message from my friend Mike, asking if I wanted to grab breakfast in the morning. I glanced at the man again. He seemed to notice the distraction, and after a long pause, he said, "Think it over." Then he turned and walked out, and the basement door closing softly behind him. I stayed down there for a long time, staring at the negatives, unsure what to do. The images were real. I had proof. But so was the man's warning. In the days that followed, strange things started happening. I found my camera gear moved slightly when I was sure I'd left it alone. My phone would sometimes have static or drop calls when I was in certain parts of the house. I'd hear soft footsteps outside the windows late at night, but when I looked, nothing was there. I thought about going to the police or telling someone, but who would believe me? A mysterious man in black who just shows up, tells you to erase evidence? It sounded insane. One night I looked again at the negatives and the metallic object was gone. Not faded or scratched, just completely missing from the frames where it had been. I checked the original digital files from my camera's backup, and the images were the same. It was like the object had never been captured at all. I still have the developed photos, the ones without the object, and the card the man left. I keep them in a box under my bed, along with my camera. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the storm clouds gather, I wonder if I should try chasing storms again. But something about that night and that man's question keeps me from pulling out the long lens. Maybe negatives can lie after all. Or maybe some things are better left unseen. I'd been into drone racing for a couple years by the time it happened. Not professionally or anything, just local meets and online streams mostly, but enough that I had a decent setup and a group of friends I raced with regularly. My name's Cole. I live outside Amarillo, Texas, where the wind farms spread out for miles like giant, slow-moving flowers. Perfect spot for drone racing because the thermals make the course tricky and the open space keeps us safe from people's houses or power lines. It was early May, dry but not blistering yet, and the wind had picked up in the late afternoon, just enough to give the drones a challenge without knocking them out of the sky. I was at our usual track. This cleared field near the biggest wind farm around. The turbines towered above us, spinning lazily as we set up. I'd been testing a new camera on my racer, the Sparrow MK2, hoping to get some cleaner footage for my stream. The goal was to catch smooth lines through the course and maybe snag some cool shots of the blades overhead. I launched the drone around 7 p.m., right before dusk settled in. The light was fading, but still enough to see the orange and red tips of the turbines against the sky. I pushed the throttle up and weaved through the gates we'd set, low passes, tight turns, and then a long stretch along the edge of the farm. About halfway through the run, I noticed something odd on the feed. Just past the last gate, a faint, twisting shape appeared near the tallest turbine. At first, I thought it was some trick of the light or a lens flare, but the shape spiraled upward slowly, like a smoke ring or a slow-moving vortex, twisting in place near the blades. It wasn't huge, maybe a few feet across, but it was definitely there. I tried to follow it with the drone, but right as I pushed forward, the signal started glitching. The image froze for a second, then the shape blinked out, vanished clean off the feed like it had never been there. The drone itself was fine, no loss of control or sudden drops. I landed it and checked the footage, rewinding to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The spiral was on the raw video, clear as day. I showed it to my buddy Marcus, who's into drone tech almost as much as me. We were both stumped. No one in the group had ever seen anything like that near the turbines before. Over the next few weeks, the spiral stayed in my head. I went back to the track a couple more times, but the weird shape never appeared again. Nothing else out of place, just the usual races, wind, and static-filled radio chatter. Then, about 3 weeks after that first sighting, I showed up for a late afternoon practice. The field was empty, except for a man standing near the pit area. He was wearing a black suit, odd enough for a dusty, open field with mostly casual dress, and his shoes were polished. The sun was low, making the lenses of his sunglasses gleam like mirrors. He introduced himself as Mr. Landry. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but there was something in his tone that made me listen closely. He complimented my drone skills, said he'd been watching some races online. When I asked where he was from or how he found me, he just smiled and said, "Let's just say I'm interested in the finer points of competition." We talked for maybe 10 minutes, mostly about drones, piloting, and the wind farm. I got the feeling he knew more about the spiral incident than he let on, but he never mentioned it directly. Before he left, he pulled a USB drive from his pocket and handed it to me. "This contains a copy of your last race recordings," he said. "Except the last hour." I blinked, confused. "The last hour?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Some courses shouldn't be won." He didn't stick around after that. Just walked to his car, a black sedan with tinted windows, and drove off without looking back. I plugged in the USB at home later. The files were exactly like my streams, except, sure enough, the last hour of footage was missing. The timestamp on the files showed continuous recording, but there was a chunk cut out. I checked my original files, and they all had that hour intact. So the copy was definitely altered. I tried reaching out to some of the local groups, asked if anyone else had noticed anything weird at the track, or if anyone had seen a suited guy hanging around. No one had. Marcus thought it might be some corporate or government thing trying to keep an eye on the wind farms, but no proof. After that, I stopped going out at dusk. I kept racing on weekends, but only in daylight and away from the turbines. The spiral never came back. The man in black never returned. It was subtle, almost like a warning. I don't know what courses shouldn't be won means exactly, but it felt like more than just a threat. Like I'd stumbled on something that was meant to stay hidden, and they made sure I got the message. That's the thing I can't shake. Not the shape, not the missing footage, but that line. Some courses shouldn't be won. I was working a freelance gig in the Pacific Northwest, mostly just chasing weather stories and the odd local event for an online magazine. It was mid-October, and the days were getting shorter, colder, the sky often overcast with thick, low clouds. One of those days, I decided to drive out to the coast near Astoria, Oregon. I figured the fog rolling in from the ocean might give me some good shots, maybe something moody for my portfolio. That evening, I parked my car at a small pullout near the shore. The wind was brisk, the kind that sneaks through your jacket and chills your skin. I had my camera out, pointing at the thick cloud cover hanging low over the water. It was nearly dark, just after sunset, but the horizon still held that dull orange glow. I was fiddling with my lens, trying to capture the shifting fog and the way the water rippled beneath it, when I noticed a cluster of lights moving just below the clouds. At first, I thought it was a group of fishing boats, but the lights were too uniform, too steady. They moved together like a single shape, slow and deliberate, shifting through the fog in perfect formation. I zoomed in and snapped a few pictures. That's when I saw it, a perfect triangle made up of 3 amber lights, each about the size of a street lamp, arranged with unnerving precision. They didn't blink or change intensity, and the shape didn't waver. It just slid silently beneath the cloud cover. I kept shooting, trying to track it, but the fog thickened and the lights disappeared behind the mist after maybe 5 minutes. I stayed there for a while longer, hoping it would come back, but it didn't. Back in my hotel room that night, I uploaded the photos and zoomed in on the cluster. The triangle was crystal clear in the shots, almost surreal against the cloudy backdrop. I sent a few to friends who were into this kind of weird stuff, expecting at least some skepticism or jokes. A few days later, I was walking down a busy sidewalk in downtown Portland, heading toward a coffee shop. It was mid-afternoon, cloudy but dry. As I passed a corner near a bookstore, I noticed a man in a black suit standing just outside, holding a large rolled-up print. He was middle-aged, clean-cut, hair slicked back, the kind of guy who looked like he stepped out of a corporate ad from the 50s. He caught my eye and nodded. Without a word, he unfurled the print right there on the pavement. It was my photo, the triangular lights from the coast blown up to almost 2 feet wide. I stopped, confused, and said, "That's mine. How did you get this?" He didn't smile. He just looked at the print, then back at me. "You saw the wrong part of the sky," he said calmly. I blinked, trying to figure out what he meant. "What do you mean?" Before I could ask anything else, he rolled the print back up and started walking away, disappearing into the crowd like he was never there. I stood there for a minute, staring after him, feeling like I'd just been part of some strange setup. I checked my phone to call a friend, but noticed the battery was nearly dead, even though I'd charged it fully that morning. The signal was weak too, like I was stuck in a dead zone despite being in the city. That night, I went back through my photos, trying to find anything else I missed. There was nothing but the triangle in the sky, no planes, no drones, no flares, just those 3 steady lights. Over the next few days, I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows moving just beyond street lamps, quiet footsteps behind me when I was alone, cars parked a little too long nearby with tinted windows. Once, at a gas station, a man in a black suit filled up the pump next to me. He didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead. When I glanced over, he was gone, but the pump was still running. I didn't mention any of this to friends. It felt stupid, like I was imagining it or maybe losing it. One evening, I was at a diner near my apartment, eating alone. The place was mostly empty. The lights flickered a little, the heater rattled. Outside, a cold drizzle was falling, the kind that soaks through clothes and chills your bones. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing across the street under a street lamp. Another man in black, I think. He didn't move for what felt like minutes. Then he just turned and walked away into the mist. I left the diner quickly after that. Walking home, I kept looking over my shoulder, the quiet sounds of the city seeming louder than usual. The streets were almost empty. At home, I checked my phone again. The triangle photo was gone from my gallery, replaced by a single image of an empty gray sky. I swear I didn't delete it. I tried to tell myself I must have, but it felt wrong. The next day, I saw a news report about unexplained lights reported off the coast near Astoria, around the same time I was there. Nothing official, just some locals calling it strange atmospheric phenomena. I haven't gone back to that stretch of coast since. The photo is lost, the lights vanished, but sometimes when I'm outside, especially on foggy evenings, I catch a glimpse of 3 faint points of light moving just beyond the clouds, silent and perfectly aligned. And I still wonder who that man was, standing on the sidewalk with my photo, telling me I was looking in the wrong place. I usually don't talk about this, but it's been on my mind a lot lately, so here goes. I'm Tom Keller, I'm 37, and I've been a rail fan for as long as I can remember. You know, trains, old tracks, signals, that kind of thing. I live in a small town in upstate New York, not far from some old industrial lines that haven't seen traffic in years. It's the kind of place where the rust eats the rails and the weeds push through the ties. One early fall morning, I decided to go out before dawn to check on a particular stretch of abandoned track that runs through some woods near the old quarry. I'd heard a few stories about people seeing strange lights there, but I mostly just wanted some quiet time with my camera and the rails. The sky was still dark, but the eastern horizon was starting to lighten a bit, that soft blue-gray before the sun comes up. When I got there, the air was crisp, a little damp from overnight dew, and the woods smelled like wet leaves and moss. I walked down the track, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound for miles. Then about 100 yards ahead, I saw it. Sitting right on the tracks was something that didn't belong. It was a craft of some sort. Not a train car or a truck, definitely not anything I'd ever seen. It looked like a wingless airplane, but smaller, maybe the size of a large car. Its surface gleamed faintly like brushed metal, but smoother, no rivets or seams I could make out. It had this matte gray tone that almost blended in with the mist hanging over the rails. No markings, no lights, nothing moving. Just there. I froze for a second, unsure what to think. I'm not easily rattled, but something about it felt wrong. I slowly raised my camera and took a few pictures, trying to get a better look through the fog. The shape was sharp, angular in places, but without wings or obvious doors. It looked like it was made for sliding or hovering, not rolling on wheels. I was about to step closer when I heard something. Off in the distance, the faint hum of an engine. I glanced back toward the road, expecting maybe some maintenance crew or early commuters. Instead, a black sedan pulled up and idled just at the edge of the trees near the entrance to the tracks. The driver's side window rolled down, and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with dark hair slicked back, wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive but not flashy. No tie. His face was calm but unreadable, like someone who had practiced not showing much emotion. He didn't introduce himself or ask questions. Instead, he just walked over to me and said, "Tracks lead to places you don't belong." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "What do you mean?" He looked back toward the craft, then down at the ground. "It's best you don't touch anything here. Was if it's not for casual visitors." I wasn't about to argue. The tone in his voice was low and serious, no nonsense, but I'd never seen anyone act like that over an old railroad line before. "I'm just taking pictures," I said. "I'm not looking for trouble." He nodded slowly, then turned and walked back to his car. The sedan idled quietly as he got in and drove off down the road without another word. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at the craft. Then slowly, it began to fade from view. The mist thickened, and when I looked again, it was gone. Just the empty rails and morning dew where it had been. I left the area feeling uneasy, but also curious. Over the next couple of days, I kept checking the spot, but there was no sign of the craft or the man in the suit. I told a few close friends about the encounter, but most just laughed it off. "Probably a military thing," one said, but none of it felt military to me. No helicopters, no patrol cars, no warning signs. What got stranger was that after that morning, I started noticing subtle things. Sometimes on my walks near the tracks, I'd hear footsteps behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. Or I'd catch glimpses of a shadow slipping between trees, always just out of focus. My phone would glitch too. Calls would drop when I tried to dial certain numbers, and pictures I took near the site would come out blurred or with strange light streaks. One evening, I was driving home late, and I saw headlights behind me. At first, I thought it was someone just following the road, but they stayed back, matching my speed for miles without passing. When I stopped at a light, the car behind me stopped as well, a black sedan. The driver never got out, just stared straight ahead. I took a different route once the light changed, and the car followed until I pulled into my driveway, then disappeared. I told myself I was imagining things, getting paranoid, but then the phone calls started. I'd pick up and there'd be silence on the other end. Once I heard breathing, slow and steady, then a faint click, and the line went dead. I haven't answered since. The whole thing feels like a bad dream sometimes, but the photos I took that morning are still on my camera. I keep thinking about going back to the tracks, but something holds me back. Like that man said, maybe there are places you're not meant to go. Still, every so often, when the fog rolls in thick and the night is quiet, I swear I hear the faint hum of something sliding over metal tracks that no longer exist. I was checking trail cameras in Dead Horse Canyon, up near the northern range, where the forest thins into dry, brushy hills. I volunteer for a wildlife monitoring group that keeps tabs on cougar and bobcat movements, mostly through motion-activated cams we've bolted to trees along old service roads and game trails. It's quiet work. I like that about it. That morning was hot, dry, late July. I'd parked off Forest Road 19 around 6:30 a.m. and started the hike up to the ridge. No wind, no clouds, just the buzz of insects and the crunch of gravel under my boots. The trail cameras were spaced about a mile apart, each tucked in a tree notch or zip-tied to a post. I had 4 to check that morning. First 2 were normal. Just a few deer, 1 coyote, a fox. Third one had a blown battery, so I replaced it and moved on. The last one was positioned overlooking a narrow draw where we'd found mountain lion prints last spring. It's tucked between 2 tall ponderosa pines, angled down a slope toward a low clearing. When I popped the SD card into my tablet, I noticed the last recording was from 2 nights ago. Around 2:17 a.m., the video showed the usual nighttime grain, branches swaying in infrared, a faint animal noise in the background. Then the treetops started lighting up, like moonlight, but brighter, whiter. The camera auto-adjusted, struggling to focus. At the top of the frame, just above the trees, something was there. I couldn't see it clearly, just this dark, egg-shaped blur, hovering maybe 10 or 15 feet above the canopy. No lights, no movement. It didn't drift or wobble like a drone. It just hung there. After maybe 6 seconds, it rose slowly and went out of frame. That was it. No animals showed up after that. The camera didn't record anything else the rest of the night. I watched the clip 3 times in a row, squinting at the shape, trying to convince myself it was a bug on the lens or a trick of light. But I've been reviewing trail footage for 5 years. I've seen bugs, bats, fog, snow, smoke. This wasn't any of those. I hiked back down, loaded the gear into my truck, and drove out to the ranger station just outside Wilson Creek. It's a small concrete building next to the fire lookout garage. Not usually staffed in the mornings, but I know Mike, the district ranger, and figured I could drop off the footage and ask him to review it when he was free. But when I got there, someone else was already inside. There was a black SUV parked next to the shed. No plates. I remember that because I almost backed into it pulling in, and when I looked to see if anyone was inside, the windows were tinted pitch black. The front door to the station was propped open, which is weird for Mike. He's strict about the AC and bugs. I stepped in and froze in the doorway. A man I didn't recognize was standing behind Mike's desk, going through a pile of printer paper. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a black suit, black tie, black dress shoes. No ranger badge, no patch. His hair was dark and slicked back, and his skin looked almost gray. Not pale, just slightly off, like he'd been in fluorescent lighting too long. He turned as I stepped in. His face didn't show any surprise, just this blank kind of interest, like a cashier waiting for you to speak. I said, "Is Mike around?" The man nodded once and said, "He's off-site." Then he gestured at the printouts on the desk. "You're with the Wildlife Survey, correct?" I didn't answer right away. He picked up one of the pages and held it out. It was a black and white thermal still, one of mine, from a week ago, showing a herd of elk crossing a creek. I hadn't uploaded that one to the shared drive yet. I asked, "Who are you with?" He smiled, just barely. "We work parallel to your department. You don't need to be concerned." His voice was flat, low, like he was suppressing an accent. Not robotic, exactly, just weirdly controlled, like each word was measured before he said it. He put the photo down and added, "We've reviewed your recent capture from Unit D4. That was the camera I just hiked to. I hadn't uploaded that footage yet, either. I didn't say anything. I just stood there while he walked over to a side table, picked up a manila folder, and handed it to me. Inside were several grainy printouts, stills from my video, the treetops, the shape above them, the light. He said, "We'll ask that you redirect your research efforts away from the upper ridge for the remainder of the season." That's how he said it. Redirect your research efforts. I asked if something was going on up there. He just looked at me for a moment, then said, "If you've seen anything unusual, we recommend you do not share those details outside of your team." I told him we're a volunteer group. There isn't really a team. He didn't respond. I left the folder on the desk and walked out. I didn't see the SUV drive off, but when I looked back 5 minutes later from the parking area, it was gone. Later that afternoon, I tried to upload the clip to our shared drive and my tablet crashed. Not just the video app, the whole system went dark. It took me 2 hours to get it to restart, and when it finally did, the SD card was blank. No files. I hadn't backed them up yet. I drove back out 2 days later to recheck the camera. When I got there, the unit was missing. Zip ties cut, mounting post gone. No note, no damage to the tree or signs of animals. We rotate cameras all the time, but no one from my group had been up there. When I emailed Mike asking who had access to the station that morning, he replied, "I was on fire watch all week. Nobody had my keys." I haven't brought it up again. Every now and then, I still drive past the canyon trailhead and think about hiking up there, but I never do. The last time I went near that slope, I swear I heard something above the trees. Not loud, just a soft mechanical hum, like electricity in the air. I didn't look up. I do wildlife tracking up in the Bitterroots part-time, mostly motion-activated cameras, monitoring migration patterns, predators, that sort of thing. I'm not a ranger or anything. I'm freelance, contracted through the state for seasonal work. My name's Amanda Keller, if that matters. I live down in Darby, Montana, so I usually cover the south end of the range. Quiet area. Hardly ever see anyone else up there unless it's hunting season. This was late September last year. Still warm during the day, but the mornings were starting to get that cold, sharp edge. I hiked out around 6 a.m. to check 3 trail cams near Pyramid Ridge. Real remote spot, takes a couple hours to reach from the access road. You have to cross a shallow stream and bushwhack part of it. That whole section was logged back in the 90s, so there are these weird open clearings surrounded by second growth forest. Good animal movement, especially cougars. The first 2 cameras were fine. Caught a bear sniffing around a salt lick, a couple of elk passing through at night. Third one was mounted about 15 feet up a pine overlooking a ridge drop-off. I use a telescoping pole to swap the card out. When I got the SD card loaded into my tablet, I was expecting the usual deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. Instead, the third clip stopped me cold. It was time-stamped 2:41 a.m. 2 nights before. You could see the tree canopy below, it all just waving slightly in the wind. Then the light changed. Not brighter exactly, but clearer. The infrared filter flickered like it couldn't adjust, and there was a shape just above the trees. I wouldn't call it a craft. It didn't have hard edges or blinking lights or any of the stuff you'd expect. It was just this dark oval, maybe the size of a minivan, floating silently. No movement, no sound. It wasn't reflecting light, but it wasn't casting a shadow either. Just there. It stayed in frame for 10 seconds. Then it rose straight up, out of view, no disturbance to the trees. After that, the camera recorded nothing for the rest of the night, which is strange. That's usually when the most activity happens. I rewatched the clip 6 times. Tried slowing it down, adjusting the contrast. Nothing changed. It wasn't a bird, or a bat, or fog. I've been doing this long enough to know what those look like on cam. I downloaded the footage, labeled the file, and hiked back down. Figured I'd show it to one of the rangers and see if any weather balloons or drone surveys were going on in that area. The ranger station's about 30 minutes from that trailhead. Small building with a garage and a shortwave tower, staffed by maybe 3 people at a time. I pulled in around 11 a.m. and noticed a black SUV parked out front. No markings, no plates. I remember thinking it looked federal, but not in the usual way. Not like Fish and Wildlife. Inside, the main office was quiet, nobody at the front desk. I knocked on the open door to the records room and stepped in. And there was a man I'd never seen before standing behind the computer terminal. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark suit and black tie, even though it was almost 80 degrees out. His skin looked off. Not pale, not sickly, just sort of colorless, like if you turned down the saturation on a photo. His hair was jet black, combed flat to the side, and he didn't look up when I entered. I said, "Hey, I was looking for Ranger Daly. I've got some footage she might want to see." He turned toward me, real slow, like he just remembered I existed. His eyes were strange, not glowing or anything like that, but weirdly still, like he wasn't blinking. He said, "She's in the field today. You can leave your report here." His voice didn't match his face. It was too soft, too even, like a voiceover dubbed in. I hesitated, holding the tablet under my arm. He gestured toward the desk. "Is this regarding the anomaly recorded on September 18th, 2:41 a.m.? I stopped cold. I hadn't told anyone about that yet. I asked, "How do you know about that?" He didn't answer, just looked at me. Then he said, "We've been monitoring data inconsistencies in that sector." I said, "Who's we?" He smiled. Not like he was happy, more like someone mimicking what a smile's supposed to look like. "You're advised to redirect your research efforts elsewhere," he said. I thought he was joking at first, like maybe this was some internal thing I didn't know about. But the way he said it, calm, flat, not threatening exactly, but firm, it made my stomach twist. I said, "What does that mean?" He didn't answer, just turned back to the screen and started typing something I couldn't see. I stood there for another 10 seconds, then walked out. When I got back to my truck, I noticed the back of the SUV was slightly open, like someone hadn't shut the hatch all the way. Inside, I saw cases, hard black ones, stacked neatly. No labels. I didn't stick around. That night, I tried loading the clip again, but when I opened the file, it was blank. The file still existed, same size, same timestamp, but the footage was just black screen. No sound, no static, nothing. I tried copying it to my desktop. The system froze. Eventually, I had to do a hard reset, and when the computer came back up, the file was gone. Not corrupted, gone. I went back out 2 days later to check the camera again. It was missing. No damage to the mount or signs of animal interference. Just gone, pole and all. Zip ties were still on the tree, like it'd been carefully removed. I asked around, sent text to 2 other trackers who sometimes use that ridge. Neither of them had touched it. I filed a note in the logbook, but nobody followed up. That whole week, my phone kept acting up. Calls dropping, screen freezing, compass spinning. I chalked it up to bad signal in the mountains, but it kept happening even when I was in town. 3 days after the ranger station thing, I was at the gas station in Hamilton when I saw the same black SUV across the street, parked in front of a closed antique store, no driver inside, engine off, just sitting there. I waited 10 minutes in the car, pretending to check receipts. It didn't move. Then I drove home. I've still got cameras up in other parts of the forest, but I haven't gone near Pyramid Ridge again. Not because I'm scared, I don't want to see that guy again, or whoever else he might bring. The kind of quiet he had didn't feel normal. Whatever was on that footage, it's not there anymore. But I know what I saw. I was renting a little place in northern Vermont that winter, just outside of a town called Glover. It was a converted woodshed behind someone's farmhouse, just one room with a cot, a heater, and a desk. Cheap and quiet, which is what I needed after everything fell apart in Boston. I'd been getting deeper into backyard astronomy, real amateur stuff. Mostly star fields, meteor showers, the occasional satellite flare. My gear wasn't fancy, just a used 8-inch 8 Schmidt Cassegrain I picked up secondhand and rigged onto a Skywatcher mount. I'd set up a plywood platform behind the cabin where I could leave the tripod level and undisturbed. Far enough from town to avoid light pollution and those crisp winter nights up there, some of the clearest skies I'd ever seen. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because it was the night I got the all clear to start working remotely for a graphic design firm out of Portland. I had a small celebration, a beer, a grilled cheese, and a long look at the Orion Nebula. Around 1:30 a.m., I was scanning near Betelgeuse when something odd happened. There's this one star, I still don't know what it was, off to the northeast. Not part of any major constellation, but I'd seen it before. Only this time, it blinked. Not like atmospheric distortion or clouds, but a full-on hard blink. Gone, then back. Then it flickered again, but in a weird rhythm. almost patterned. 3 quick flashes, long pause, 2 more flashes, then nothing. I kept the scope locked on it for another hour, but it just sat there like normal. I checked my notes, tried to replicate the angle, checked my lenses, power source, even swapped eyepieces, but I couldn't recreate what I saw. Eventually, I went inside, wrote it down in my logbook, and figured maybe it was just a trick of light or my own fatigue. 2 nights later, I saw someone in the woods behind the observatory window. Now, let me back up. That observatory was just a window I'd installed a blackout panel on, so I could leave the scope inside and open it out into the cold air without flooding the room with light. I didn't have a dome or anything. The telescope stuck out maybe a foot beyond the sill. Around 2 a.m., I was half dozing at the desk waiting for a patch of cloud cover to clear. When I opened my eyes, I noticed something through the gap in the curtain. A man, standing completely still just past the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. He was looking through a telescope. Not mine, his own. A black tube on a matte black tripod, no markings I could see. He was tall and very thin, wearing a black overcoat and dark slacks, no gloves, even in the snow. His skin looked almost bluish in the moonlight. He didn't move. At first I thought maybe it was a prank, someone from town messing with me, but there were no footprints in the snow leading to where he stood. Nothing. The snow had fallen fresh earlier that afternoon, at least 2 inches, and it was perfectly undisturbed. I watched him for maybe 10 minutes. He didn't shift or adjust the scope, didn't take notes, just stood there, eyes to the eyepiece, like he was watching something intently. Eventually I closed the blackout panel and just sat on the floor, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to go outside, and calling the police felt stupid. What would I even say? When I looked again, just before dawn, he was still there. By the time the sun came up, he was gone. No tracks, no scope, no trace he'd ever been there. I tried to forget about it. I didn't mention it to the owners of the farmhouse. I just stopped using the scope for a while. But 2 days later, I found something taped to the outside of the observatory window. It was a piece of black paper about the size of a bookmark. On it was a perfect white circle, centered, nothing else. No tape edges, no moisture damage despite the snow. It wasn't there when I went to bed. I didn't touch it. I left it there for hours. Around noon, it was gone. No wind that day, no footprints. The week after that, strange things kept happening. The power in the cabin flickered, but never fully went out. My telescope mount began to drift, just slightly a few degrees off no matter how often I recalibrated. One night I found the scope turned toward the woods, even though I hadn't touched it. Then came the whispering. It wasn't voices, not exactly. More like a mechanical hum, buried just low enough in frequency that I couldn't tell if it was in the air or in my ears. Only happened at night. I tried recording it, but the playback always came out blank. One night I heard footsteps crunching the snow around the cabin. Not fast, not approaching, just a slow circle. I shut off the lights and waited. Nothing. When I opened the door, the yard was empty. That's when I stopped sleeping altogether. I moved the telescope into the cabin and locked the window shut. I sealed the blackout panel and taped it from the inside. I even started keeping a knife by the bed, which I hated doing, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone was just watching. On my last night there, the stars disappeared. Not behind clouds, just gone. I stepped outside around 11 p.m. to check on the satellite dish after a dropped connection. The sky was clear, moonless, but there were no stars, just pitch black void. I waited, 15-20 minutes, still nothing. Then the stars came back, all at once. Same positions, same brightness, just back. The next morning I packed everything I owned into the truck and left before sunrise. I didn't tell the farmhouse owners. I didn't say goodbye. I just drove. That was a year ago. I haven't used the telescope since. I was running I-25 south through New Mexico when it happened, somewhere between Las Vegas and Truth or Consequences. It was around 3:30 in the morning, late April. Not much traffic at that hour, just the occasional rig headed northbound. I'd been on the road for almost 9 hours, hauling steel coils to El Paso, and I was planning to pull over at a truck stop just past Socorro for a quick nap and coffee. The weather was dry, clear skies, cool enough that I didn't need the AC, but not cold enough to run the bunk heater either. I was cruising steady, listening to a scratchy AM station playing old country ballads. The kind of drive where everything blurs together. Dotted lines, exit signs, and silence. Then I saw the overpass. I knew that stretch well. There's a long curve leading into it, and you can usually see the structure a good half-mile ahead, silhouetted by your own headlights bouncing off the signs. Only this time, something was wrong. There was something sitting on top of the overpass. At first, I thought it might be a crane or maybe some highway equipment parked up there, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a vehicle. It was a shape flat, wide, and low to the surface. A perfect triangle, matte black. It looked like it was perched on the overpass, not parked. No lights, no markings, nothing reflective. I took my foot off the gas, and the truck began to slow. No brakes, just coasting. I don't know why I did it. Some part of me didn't want to drive under it. As I got closer, maybe 100 yards out, I blinked. Just a normal blink, and it was gone. Not flew off. Not vanished into the distance. It just wasn't there anymore. I came to a full stop in the middle of the lane, no other cars around, just me and the quiet whine of the engine idling. I flipped on the hazards, got out, walked a few feet from the cab, and looked up at the overpass. Nothing. I even climbed the embankment and stood on the shoulder. No tire tracks, no fresh scuffs on the pavement. Just empty road and desert stretching out in every direction. I stayed there longer than I meant to. Must have been 15 minutes before I climbed back in the truck and eased it forward. Everything felt too quiet. Even the radio had turned to static. I didn't stop again until the Flying J on the edge of Socorro. Parked around back, shut the engine off, grabbed a sandwich from the cooler, and went inside to stretch my legs. The place was dead. Just one old guy at the register and a couple drivers nodding off in the lounge. I sat in a corner booth with my food and coffee facing the window. I wasn't hungry, just needed a minute to shake the weird feeling. That's when the man sat down. I hadn't seen him come in. He slid into the booth across from me without a word. Clean-shaven, pale as a sheet, wearing a black suit and a tie that looked like it had just been ironed. No jacket, no bag. His hands were folded neatly on the table. The strangest thing, his clothes weren't dusty. In the middle of a desert truck stop, his shoes looked polished. He didn't look at me right away, just stared past me out the window like he was watching the fuel pumps. Then, without blinking, he said, "Routes change when you watch the sky." His voice was flat, no accent, no inflection, like he was reading it off a card. I didn't say anything. I just sat there. My coffee was halfway to my mouth and stayed there. Then he looked at me finally and said, "You didn't drive under it." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and walked out. Not rushed, just calm. Like he'd finished what he came to do. I got up and followed. Not even sure why. Curiosity, maybe. When I stepped outside, he wasn't there. The parking lot was empty except for a couple rigs and a fuel tanker. I asked the cashier if anyone else had come in. He looked confused and said no, not in the last half hour. I checked the security cam monitor above the counter. It was cycling through feeds. Lot, pumps, diner area, front door. I didn't see him on any of them. Not entering, not leaving. Just me walking to the booth, then standing up and going outside. I left soon after, drove the last stretch to El Paso without stopping. The whole way down, I kept catching glimpses of things in my side mirror. Shadows that didn't line up with the road. Lights flickering in the hills that weren't from towers or traffic. At one point, I passed a black SUV idling on the shoulder, headlights off. Driver was wearing sunglasses. At 5 a.m., I didn't report it. Who would I even tell? The dispatcher? State police? I've run that route dozens of times since then, and that overpass is still there. Nothing strange about it, but I don't slow down when I pass under it anymore. I just keep my eyes on the road. My name's Keith Maddox. I've been running the Midnight Ferry out of Port Townsend going on 11 years now. I don't usually tell this story, but it's been sitting with me longer than I expected. It was a Thursday night in early May, clear skies, water calm as glass. We were on the late run, me, one deckhand named Eli, and a handful of passengers headed to Whidbey Island. Pretty normal night. We left the dock around 12:05 a.m., 10 minutes behind because of some late arrivals. By the time we were halfway across, about 12:20 or so, most of the passengers had gone inside. It was chilly, but still. No wind, no chop. You could hear everything. Engine hum, ropes creaking, Eli fiddling with his vape behind the cabin. I was up in the wheelhouse, autopilot on, scanning ahead like always. I don't listen to music. I like to hear what's around me. About 2 miles out from the island, I noticed something moving off our starboard side. Not big, maybe the size of a basketball. A glowing orb, bluish-white, maybe 6 feet off the surface. It wasn't flying like a drone. It was gliding just above the water, pacing with us. Every time I'd slow down or shift the rudder slightly, it would match us. No sound. At first, I thought it might be some kind of weird reflection off our lights, but when I stepped out onto the side deck to get a better angle, it was still there, still moving, skimming smooth as anything. I called Eli up. I didn't tell him what I saw, just asked him to step out and look. He leaned over the railing and just froze. "You seeing that?" I asked. He nodded. "What the hell is that?" We stood there watching it for maybe a full minute. Then it veered sharply away from us, like 90 degrees, no arc, just sudden, and zipped out over the water. Gained elevation fast, maybe 30 feet up, then shot straight into the clouds and vanished. No sound, no trail, no nothing. I didn't report it. I've seen weird lights out here before, nothing like that, but still, I figured maybe some experimental drone or whatever. I didn't want it on the log. We docked at the island around 12:45, dropped off the passengers, loaded up for the return trip. Everything went like normal. The next morning, I got a call at home around 7:30. That's not unusual. Sometimes dispatch checks in early if there's mechanical stuff. But this wasn't anyone I knew. Guy said he was with the Coast Guard, wanted to do a surprise safety inspection before the next run. Said he and a colleague would be on the dock around 10. They showed up in a black SUV, no Coast Guard markings. Both men in suits. Not uniforms. Plain black suits with white shirts, black ties. No clipboards, no tools, no IDs. One was tall and thin, with very light skin, almost grayish. The other was shorter, stockier, and wore these old-fashioned black glasses that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 50s. They didn't shake hands or introduce themselves, just asked if we could walk through the vessel. I figured maybe they were undercover or something, though that didn't make much sense. I brought them on board. Eli hadn't shown up yet. We started in the wheelhouse. They didn't check the logs. They didn't even look at the equipment. The tall one stood by the door while the one with the glasses just stared out the window. "You ever see anything unusual on these waters?" he asked, still looking out. "Define unusual," I said. He turned and gave me this deadpan smile. "Lights, shapes, things that don't belong." I shrugged. "Sometimes you see stuff." "Last night?" the tall one said. "Did you see anything last night?" Something about the way he asked it rubbed me wrong. Too direct, not like an investigator, like someone who already knew the answer. I lied and said no, just a routine night. The short one stepped closer. "You sure?" he asked. "Because some people, when they're tired, imagine things." I looked at him. "I don't imagine things." He didn't blink, didn't move, just held that stare. Then they asked to see the lower deck. Again, no questions about lifeboats or fire suppression. They didn't check the engine room, didn't look at anything mechanical. Just walked slowly along the edge, glancing out at the water. "Anyone with you last night?" the tall one asked. I told them Eli was on deck crew. "Did he see anything?" "No." They nodded again. I started to get the feeling they weren't actually interested in what I saw. They were more interested in whether I'd talk about it. We finished the walkthrough and headed back onto the dock. I asked if they needed to sign anything or leave paperwork. The shorter one smiled again and said, "No need, just routine." Then they got back in their SUV and left. I waited until they were gone before I called Eli. Told him not to mention anything about the light. He agreed. That evening, when we went out for the next run, Eli brought a set of binoculars. We scanned the water constantly. Nothing showed. No lights, no orbs. But 2 nights later, after a 1 a.m. trip back from the island, I noticed my truck had been moved. Just a few inches, barely off the line. But I always parked the same way. My seat was adjusted too. Slightly lower. There weren't any signs of break-in, nothing stolen. But the dome light didn't turn on when I opened the door. I checked under the dash, half expecting to find a tracker or something. Nothing there. Haven't seen those 2 men again. But for the next month, every time I made the midnight run, I'd catch myself scanning the water. Not just for the orb, honestly, I don't expect to see it again, but for anything, any sign someone's still watching. It was around 3:10 a.m. on a Thursday. I remember that because my shift at Brookhill Medical runs from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and we always restock crash carts at 3. That night had been unusually quiet. No new admits since midnight. I was sitting at the nurse's station in ICU 3, catching up on charting, when I noticed the hallway lights flicker. Not all of them, just the row that runs past room 314 to the fire exit. It was a short buzz and then back to normal. I didn't think much of it at first. This building's old. The ICU is on the 5th floor, and we get occasional surges from the HVAC systems kicking in. But maybe 10 minutes later, the flickering came back. Longer this time, like a slow dimming, fading in and out. And I heard this faint clicking sound, almost like the hum you get when you stand under a transformer. I walked toward the fire exit to check if one of the bulbs was going bad. As I passed room 314, I noticed the blinds on the double doors were open. Mr. Garza was in there, one of our long-term patients, intubated, sedated, not conscious. But he was moving. He had one hand raised like he was reaching toward the ceiling, eyes still shut. The monitors weren't alarming. Nothing out of normal. I stood there and watched his hand slowly fall back to the bed. Then I saw movement through the window behind him. We've got a small rooftop area beyond that side of the unit. It's not accessible to the public, maintenance only. It's covered in gravel and vent hoods and those big metal boxes for the HVAC units. I've seen it during the day a few times when housekeeping props the door open to air out the linen room. At night, it's just dark. But something was up there. I caught a flicker of movement behind one of the vent stacks. A shape, tall, narrow, like a person standing too still, watching. I thought it might be security doing rounds, but we don't normally have anyone up there. There's no reason for it unless something's broken. I stepped closer to the window. I couldn't see a face, but I could see the shape clearly. It wasn't crouching or walking. It was just there, perfectly upright, backlit by the city lights bouncing off the cloud cover. The head was tilted slightly, and the arms hung too straight, like someone pretending to be a mannequin. Then the lights flickered again, harder this time, and when they came back on full, the shape was gone. I radioed down to the front desk and asked if anyone was on the roof. They said no. I asked if security could check the access hatch. A few minutes later, they called back saying it was still locked from the inside. I didn't report what I saw. I figured maybe it was a shadow or a hallucination from being up too many nights in a row. But I started feeling uneasy. That part of the unit felt colder than the rest. Even the other nurses mentioned it later, joking around about ghosts in the vents. But I didn't laugh. When my shift ended, I went down to the break room to clock out. I was halfway there when I saw a man standing near the vending machines by the elevator. He didn't belong there. Pressed black suit, pale, neat, like he had just stepped out of a catalog. He didn't look like a rep or a doctor or security. No badge, no scrubs. He wasn't looking at the machines, just standing there facing the elevators, holding a slim black folder under one arm. I slowed my pace without meaning to. Something about him made my stomach drop. As I walked past, he stepped forward and said my full name, not, "Excuse me, are you?" Just said it, like he already knew. I stopped. He handed me the folder. Inside was a single-page form. It didn't have a hospital letterhead or anything official looking. It was printed on plain white paper with a typed statement about an anomalous rooftop event witnessed during the hours of 2:45 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. on April 11th. It said that the witness, me, agreed not to discuss any visual or auditory phenomena observed during that window with hospital staff, patients, media, or law enforcement. There was a line for my signature and a space for a date and time. I asked him what it was for. He said, "This is for the hospital's internal review. It will not go on your employment record. It is strongly advised that you cooperate." His voice was flat, no trace of an accent, but the words were overly formal, like someone reading a script translated into English. I noticed his tie pin had a symbol on it, a circle with a line through it, not a brand logo, nothing I recognized. I told him I wasn't signing anything without a supervisor present. He didn't respond, just stood there holding the folder toward me, not blinking. After maybe 15 seconds, the elevator dinged behind him and two techs stepped out. The man in the suit turned and walked away without saying anything else. I watched him go down the hall toward the old records room. Then he turned a corner and was gone. I brought the form to my supervisor that afternoon. She looked confused, said she didn't know of any internal reviews or rooftop incidents, and that all hospital forms go through admin. She took the folder and said she'd follow up. Next night, she told me the folder was empty when she opened it again. I haven't seen the man since, but every once in a while, when I take the supply elevator near the West Wing, I feel like someone's watching from behind the old access door to the roof. And the lights still flicker. Same hallway, same time. I was doing a live stream up at Devil's Bluff when it started. It's this rocky overlook out past Kingsfield, maybe 30 minutes from town, surrounded by thick forest. Locals always said weird stuff happens out there. Lights in the sky, electronics acting up, that kind of thing. I host a small podcast called Signal Scan, mostly late night AM radio types and conspiracy people tuning in. It's not big, but I've got a loyal group who follow the live sessions. This was a Saturday night in early April. Still cold after dark, but clear skies. I hiked up with a mic rig, external battery, and my laptop, planning to do a midnight stream. I'd been teasing it all week. Live from the bluff, that kind of thing. Mostly just ambiance, talking through old sightings, answering questions from chat. The setup took a bit, no cell towers nearby, so I'd rigged a hotspot through a portable satellite dish. Not the most reliable thing, but it worked well enough for voice and audio. Video was grainy, but that was part of the appeal. Low light, fuzzy shadows, wind in the mic. Around 12:30 a.m., I was midway through answering a question about triangulation flight paths when I thought I heard something. It was faint, under the wind and static, just a quick breathy sound, like someone whispering close to the mic. I paused, thinking maybe my headset caught some feedback, but it didn't repeat. I said something like, "Anybody else hear that?" A couple people in the chat said they caught it too. "Play that back," someone wrote. So I replayed the last 30 seconds. It was there, just under my voice. "Leave now." Not loud, not threatening, just flat, mechanical almost, like a recording. I laughed it off, made a joke about pranksters in the woods, but I muted the mic for a second and scanned the tree line with a flashlight. Nothing, just rocks and brush. No animals, no footsteps. I thought maybe a second mic channel picked up interference or cross-signal bleed, but there was no other input source running, just the main feed. I kept streaming for another hour. My viewers kept joking about the whisper, dropping timestamp theories, and tagging it bluff voice. I leaned into it. Gotta play to the audience, right? Around 1:45 a.m., the laptop froze. Not crashed, just locked. The screen stayed lit, but the mouse wouldn't move, and all the keys were dead. The audio cut, but the software didn't register any error. The hotspot still blinked like it had a signal. I tapped the lid, nothing. Then the laptop fan kicked up to full blast, louder than it's ever been, like it was overheating, but the metal casing stayed cold. A low static buzz came through the headset. No waveform on the recorder. I shut the system down and packed up fast. It didn't feel right up there anymore. The trees were too still, and I kept thinking I saw movement just past the light, something black shifting against black. I hiked back to the car, which was parked about half a mile down the trail. The whole time I felt like I was being followed. Not footsteps, exactly. Just this pressure, like someone walking a few paces behind, stopping when I stopped. Got to the car, tossed the gear in the back, drove home. Didn't see any other vehicles the whole way. I live in a basement apartment in Kingsfield, though, nothing fancy. Got in, locked the door, crashed on the couch. Next morning, I booted everything up to clean the stream and get it posted. The file was there, labeled and timestamped, exactly 2 hours long. Except the last 30 minutes were missing. Not cut off, just gone. Like the stream ended clean at 1:30, even though I was up there past 2. I checked the local save, the cloud backup, everything. Same result. I went on the stream dashboard. No errors, no drops logged. The chat feed showed timestamps all the way to the end, but the video cut mid-sentence. Just ended. Then around 3 p.m. someone knocked at my door. Not common. I live on the side of a duplex with a shared driveway and nobody uses the front entrance. I opened it halfway and there were two men standing on the porch, both wearing black suits, black ties, white shirts, no coats, even though it was still cold out. One had round glasses, the other didn't. They weren't smiling. "Mr. Pierce?" the one with glasses asked. I nodded. He held out a small USB stick. "You'll want to back up your recording properly." I took it without thinking. The other man said audio quality was good. Interference started around 147. Neither of them had accents. Their voices sounded plain, like news anchors. Very deliberate, no slang, no warmth. I said, "Who are you with?" They both looked at each other, then back at me. "We suggest you reconsider the narrative," the first one said. Then they turned and walked down the drive. No car in sight. By the time I got out to the sidewalk, they were gone. I went back in, plugged in the USB. It had a single folder labeled DB Stream Final. Inside were two files, one video, one audio. Both were full length, 2 hours, 3 minutes. My intro, the questions, the whisper, it was all there, except the last hour was different. It wasn't blacked out or cut, it was replaced. My voice kept talking, but not in real time. It was like a stitched-together monologue made from older clips. I'd hear myself say phrases I recognized from earlier episodes strung together in weird ways. Chat responses that didn't match the questions. Dead air filled with forest sounds I never recorded. There was no static, no laptop freeze, no leave now, no panic in my voice. Just a calm, fake version of me wrapping up a normal show. I checked the metadata. Creation date that morning. Author blank. No location tags. No editing software listed. I haven't done a live stream since. My name's Dylan Carr. I was working a contract gig down in southeast New Mexico, not far from where the old radar tower sits outside White Oaks. The tower's been shut down for decades, Cold War relic, fenced off, rusting. But the land got approved for some private development, so they brought us in to do soil cores and subsurface testing. Just me and two other guys bouncing around in an old Dodge with a rig trailer hooked on the back. It was late September, right at that point where the desert heat drops off hard after sunset. We were working long days, trying to knock out as many drill sites as we could before the real cold set in. Our trailer was parked maybe 200 yards from the base of the tower. We weren't allowed past the fencing, but a few of our bore sites ran real close to it, within 50 feet. On the third day out there, I was working a solo drill run while the other guys went into town to resupply. I'd done a dozen of these cores already. Drop the bit, pull out a few feet of soil, catalog it, mark any groundwater. It's boring work, to be honest, but I like being alone. Got my little radio clipped to the truck, lunch in the cooler, peace and quiet. That day I hit something solid at about 5 feet down. Not rock either, more like metal, clean, not rusted. I pulled the bit back up, expecting to see it jammed, but it was clean. I ran a small hand auger down and scooped around whatever was in there. After maybe 20 minutes of work, I pulled up this shard. I don't know what else to call it. Maybe 5 inches long, tapered, maybe an inch wide at its thickest point, but totally smooth. Perfectly smooth, like glass, but metallic. No seams, no markings. Cold to the touch, even though it had just been under dirt in the sun. The weird part was it didn't feel heavy. Not light, exactly, but not right. Off. I cleaned it off, snapped a photo on my phone, and set it on the fold-out table next to my logbook. Figured maybe it was some piece of scrap left over from the radar days. We'd found a few bolts, old cables, stuff like that. But this felt different. Too refined. No corrosion. Like it hadn't aged at all. I worked the rest of the day like normal. Did 2 more cores, wrapped up just before sundown. That area gets real quiet after dark. No traffic, no people, just winding through mesquite and the occasional coyote. By the time I was back in the trailer, the sky was black and the generator was humming low. I was halfway through heating up a can of chili when someone knocked on the trailer door. I didn't hear a vehicle pull up, and the area around the site is all gravel and scrub. You can't sneak up on it. I opened the door and there was a man standing there. Black suit, black tie, clean white shirt, shiny black shoes. No dust on him at all. He looked out of place. Way too clean for being out here in the middle of nowhere. He didn't introduce himself, just looked past me and said, "You found something today." I didn't answer at first, just stared at him. He was average height, pale, no expression. His voice was quiet, but I had every word clear over the generator, like it cut through the background. Finally, I said, "What are you talking about?" He nodded toward the table inside. "The object? May I look?" I don't know why I let him in. Something about the way he asked made it feel like I didn't really have a choice. He stepped inside, moved slow, didn't touch anything, just looked at the shard, bent down a little to study it. He kept his hands behind his back the whole time. After a minute, he straightened up and said, "Some artifacts belong underground." That's all he said. Then he turned around and walked out. No goodbye, no name. I stepped outside behind him, trying to see where he was headed, but there was nothing. No headlights, no engine, no sound. He was just gone. I checked the gravel road with my flashlight, no tire tracks. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the shard wrapped in a towel, stuffed in my toolbox. Locked the trailer up tight. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked, nothing. Just the wind. Next morning, my coworkers came back. I didn't say anything about the man or the shard. I just went about the day like nothing had happened. I kept the shard with me, though, hidden in my truck's glove box. I don't know why. Part of me didn't want to let it go. A few days later, we wrapped the job and moved on to another site an hour west. I took the shard home after the contract ended, put it in a drawer in my garage. About a week after that, I came home from work to find my garage door wide open. Nothing stolen, nothing touched, except the drawer with the shard. It was open, empty. No signs of forced entry, no prints, no cameras either. Just gone. That same night, I found a business card slid under my front door. No name, no number, just a black circle on white cardstock. That was it. I threw it away. Haven't seen anything since. We rented the boat out of Crescent Harbor, just south of Ventura. It was me, my wife Allison, and our daughter Grace. Grace had just turned 11. The trip was supposed to be a little early summer send-off before school ended. Nothing fancy. Just a 3-day sail up the coast, anchoring near secluded beaches and sleeping on board. We'd done a similar trip the year before, and it was peaceful. No internet, no noise, just ocean. We took out a Catalina 36, roomy enough to not feel cramped, small enough for the three of us to handle. The marina gave us a logbook, a clipboard, and spare keys. I filled in our plan, out to San Miguel, a night there, then east toward the shoreline again to anchor off Refugio Beach. Last stop was supposed to be just past El Capitan before heading back. The weather was clear all 3 days. Light wind, smooth current, sunny, but not too hot. By the second night, we were anchored maybe 100 yards offshore, just west of Gaviota. I had the stove running for coffee, and Grace was up on deck watching the horizon with binoculars. Allison was inside trying to get the cabin light working. It kept flickering, even though the battery was full. At some point, Grace said, "There's a star in the water." I stepped up to check. It was around 9:20 p.m., just past nautical twilight. I thought she meant a boat light or some satellite reflection. But when I looked out, there was this small white glow just above the ocean, almost level with the horizon line. It wasn't moving. No reflection in the water, just suspended there, maybe 2-3 feet above the surface. It was round but not sharp, kind of blurred at the edges, like fog. I figured maybe it was a drone from one of the research boats that passed through sometimes, or even something from the Navy base down south. I was about to say that when the light started to rise. Not fast, not slow, just up, perfectly straight, no sound. Allison came up behind me and said, "What's that?" The three of us stood there, watching it. It hovered maybe 50 feet off the water, then stopped again. No blinking lights, no movement side to side. It didn't cast a beam. It just hung there as if gravity didn't apply to it. Then the mast light dimmed, just a little, and the cabin light shut off completely. I tried the switch, then the radio. Nothing. The power panel still showed charge, but the switches weren't responding. The GPS screen turned gray. No signal. I even tried the emergency beacon test. It gave a weak red blink and went dead. The strange thing was the boat didn't feel dead. You know how electronics sometimes fail and everything kind of quiets? It wasn't like that. The water still lapped against the hull. The breeze was steady. The only thing that changed was us. We weren't talking. Not because we were afraid exactly, more like we didn't want to draw attention. Grace asked if she could go inside, and Allison took her below. I kept watching the light. Eventually it started to move, slowly east, along the horizon, keeping low, never more than 100 feet off the surface. I followed it until it disappeared behind the curve of the coast. It took maybe 3 minutes. The lights came back on maybe 5 minutes later. Everything powered up at once. The cabin light flickered, the GPS reset, the radio clicked back to its standby channel. No error messages, no logs of outages. I didn't mention it to the harbor office when we returned the next afternoon. Didn't really know how to explain it. But the guy at the desk, a tall man in a black suit, which was weird enough for a marina, asked for our logbook. I handed it to him, and he flipped straight to the second page without reading the front. He didn't check the times or coordinates, just glanced at the notes and said, "You were west of Gaviota last night?" I nodded. He paused for a second, then handed back our key fob. "Some voyages end before the dock," he said. I didn't respond, just took the keys and walked out. I don't think he worked there. I've been back since, a couple times. Nobody's seen anyone by that description. The regular guy at the office says he's the only one who handles returns. I was out in the middle of nowhere, south of Gainesville, Texas, mapping sinkholes for the state geology department. It was late September, dry and warm during the day, but the nights got cool. The pasture where I was working was huge, barely a fence line in sight, just miles of grass and scrub dotted with little hollows and depressions. Mostly harmless stuff, but some of these sinkholes could collapse suddenly, so part of my job was to document them and warn landowners. I'd been out there for a few days, driving my pickup along dirt trails and marking GPS points whenever I found something new. One afternoon, I came across a hole that looked a little different. It wasn't very big, maybe 10 feet across, but the grass right around it was thinner, and the edges looked oddly smooth, almost polished. The sun was low, casting long shadows, and I crouched down to inspect it. That's when I noticed the faint humming. It was low and constant, not something you'd expect from a sinkhole. I sat on the ground, quiet, trying to pick it apart from the background noise, bugs, wind through the grass. But it was definitely coming from the hole itself. The hum wasn't loud, more like a vibration you felt through the soles of your boots. I pulled out my phone to record it. The audio was weak, but you could hear a steady drone in the background. I was curious, but figured it might be some natural gas or something like that. I took measurements, snapped some photos, and marked it on my map. I planned to call it in to my supervisor when I got back to town. That night, I camped near the pasture's edge. I had my old tent, a camp stove, and a cooler with some food. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp. The kind of night that feels quiet but heavy, you know? I sat outside the tent, trying to listen for that hum again. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, deeper and more persistent in the dark. At around midnight, I thought I heard something else, a faint crunch of tires on dirt. I froze and looked out toward the pasture. The moon was just a sliver, but enough to make out shapes. I saw 2 ATV-sized vehicles creeping through the grass, their headlights off, moving slowly and deliberately toward the sinkhole. I wanted to call out or flash my lantern, but something stopped me. The air felt tense, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The 2 vehicles stopped a few feet from the hole. 2 men stepped out, both wearing black from head to toe. They looked like security guys, or maybe some kind of federal agents, but there was nothing official about their clothes, no badges or insignia, just plain black suits and hats. They moved with purpose, scanning the area around the hole. I ducked behind a tree and watched. They pulled out some small devices. Nothing I recognized, just black boxes with blinking lights and buttons, and started scanning the ground around the depression. After a few minutes, one of them knelt down and put his hand near the edge of the hole. The humming seemed to get stronger for a moment, then it stopped entirely. It was like the hole went dead. The 2 men stood up, exchanged a few words quietly, and then one of them said something I couldn't quite hear. The other nodded and walked over to me. I stayed hidden at first, but then he called out in a calm voice, "You shouldn't be here." I stepped out slowly, hands raised a little to show I wasn't a threat. He looked at me with eyes that were cold and sharp. "This site isn't for study," he said flatly. I told him I was just doing my job, mapping sinkholes for the state. I explained the humming. He didn't seem interested in my explanation. "Some places aren't meant to be disturbed," he said. I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head and said, "Go home. Don't come back." His companion didn't say anything but watched me like a hawk. I packed up my camp that night, feeling weird, like I'd stepped into something I wasn't supposed to. On the drive back to Gainesville, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those black ATVs following me. I never called my supervisor about that sinkhole. The next day, I went back out with a coworker, but the hole was gone. The grass looked normal, no dip in the ground, but nothing unusual. I checked my phone and the recording of the hum was gone too, like the file had never existed. That was a few months ago. I still don't know what I saw that night or who those men were, but whatever it wasn't just a sinkhole. I worked the night shift at a convenience store on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Iowa. Nothing fancy, just the usual mix of snacks, cheap coffee, and gas pumps out front. The store was a little out of the way, near a patch of woods and farmland, so traffic dropped off pretty quick after midnight. That was the quiet part of my shift. The hours where I'd mostly just be restocking shelves or cleaning up while half listening to the radio. One night in late October, just before 2 a.m., I was wiping down the counter when I noticed something through the glass doors. At first, it was just a tiny point of light hovering maybe 50 feet from the entrance near the edge of the parking lot. The light was just small, almost like a star stuck low near the tree line. But it wasn't moving or blinking like a plane or a drone. It was steady, just hanging there. I thought maybe it was some kind of reflection from a street lamp or headlights, but the lot was empty, and the only street lamp nearby was a block away, too far to cast a light there. I shrugged it off, but it stayed. For the next hour, I kept catching glimpses of it when I glanced outside during breaks or restocking. What started to feel weird was how long it stayed in the exact same spot. It didn't drift or flicker, and I could swear it was dimmer than any normal light source. Sometimes it looked closer, sometimes farther, but never moved horizontally, just hung there like it was watching. Around 3:30, the light suddenly got a bit brighter. I remember thinking it might be a flashlight someone left on or a lantern, but when I peeked out the door, there was nothing. No car, no person. I was alone. At one point, the store's outdoor security camera blinked off. The monitors inside flashed static for a second, then came back. I didn't know if it was just a glitch or something else, but it felt like the light and the camera thing were connected. After a while, maybe around 4 a.m., I got curious enough to grab my jacket and step outside. The air was cold, thick with that early fall dampness, and the lot was still empty except for the light. When I walked closer, it just vanished, like it blinked out the second I hit the edge of the lot. That was it. No flash, no movement, just gone. I headed back inside, feeling a little unsettled, but telling myself it was probably some kind of weird light reflection or even fatigue messing with my eyes. The next morning, I got off my shift around 6:30, and as I walked out, I noticed a man standing just outside the glass doors, staring in. He was wearing a black suit and a tie that didn't quite fit the casual feel of the town. His hair was neat, but not flashy, and his expression was blank, like he was waiting for something. I froze for a second. The parking lot was empty, no cars except mine and the store's delivery truck. I figured I'd just get in my car and leave, but as I grabbed my bag from the counter earlier, I caught him glancing away briefly and then looking back right at me. When I locked the door behind me, he didn't move, just stood there, staring through the glass. I don't know if he was waiting for someone else or if he'd been there all night, but it felt like he was connected to whatever that light was the night before. I didn't say anything. I got in my car and left without looking back. The weird thing was, when I came in the next night to work again, the parking lot was spotless, the light was gone, and security footage from the night before had a blacked out hour exactly when I saw the light hover. No explanation, just that strange presence. And the man in black, standing silently in the daylight, watching me leave like he was waiting for me to disappear. I was out early that morning, just after the sun started coming up, fixing some trail signs along the ridge in the southern part of the forest preserve. The air was cool, still holding on to the dampness from the night, and there was that quiet you get when the world's just waking up, birds starting their calls, leaves barely stirring. It was the kind of morning that makes you think the day is going to be normal. No surprises. I was halfway through replacing a faded directional sign near the edge of a cliff that overlooks the valley below. The trail there is narrow, and I had to be careful with my footing. I'd been working on the preserve for about 5 years, mostly doing this kind of maintenance, fixing signs, clearing fallen branches, that sort of thing. Quiet work, nothing too exciting. Then I heard it. A low rumble, not like thunder, more mechanical, almost like a distant engine. I looked up toward the cliff face to my left, the one that drops off steeply into the trees below. That's when I saw it, a black disc, smooth and wingless, sliding silently behind the rock. It was about the size of a small car, but the way it moved didn't make sense. It wasn't flying in a typical way, no sound other than that low rumble, no wings or rotors. It vanished behind the cliff quickly, but there was no way it could have landed or hidden completely without leaving some sign. I stood there for a while, heart pounding, just staring where it had disappeared. The forest was silent again, except for the occasional bird call. No footprints, no scuff marks, nothing. I packed up my tools faster than usual and headed back to the ranger station. I told myself maybe I was imagining things, maybe it was a trick of the light or some new kind of drone I hadn't heard about. But that low rumble kept echoing in my mind. The next morning, I came back to the trail early, hoping to catch a better look, or at least see something that explained what I'd seen. When I got there, the whole area around that cliff was cordoned off with yellow tape. There was a black SUV parked nearby and a man standing by the tape, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. No badge visible, no name tag, just a thin briefcase in one hand and a calm, serious expression. He saw me approach and nodded, like he was expecting me. "You can't go past here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This area is off limits from now on." I asked who he was, what agency he represented. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled out a card with an emblem I didn't recognize, just a black symbol on a white background. No department name, no contact info. "Why is this area closed?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "There are things here that don't belong to this world. It's better if people don't come near." I blinked, trying to figure out if he was joking or serious. There was no humor in his face. "Who are you?" I pressed. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say we take care of things that shouldn't be seen." That morning, the tape stayed up, and for the first time since I started working the trails, that section was officially off limits. I tried to get answers from my supervisor, but all the emails and calls about it got stonewalled or ignored. It was like the whole thing vanished from the official records. The whole week after, I kept going back to the edge of the tape, staring at the cliff where I'd seen that black disc. The forest felt different, heavier, somehow. At dusk, sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of something moving just out of sight, shapes that didn't quite belong. And every time I passed the area on patrol, I'd see the same black SUV parked a little ways off the trailhead, but no one ever seemed to be inside. Just an empty car, waiting. I never saw the man in the suit again, but I still wonder what exactly was behind that cliff. Whatever it wasn't meant for me or anyone else. The silence around that place says it all. Some things don't want to be found. I drove a taxi in Phoenix for a couple years, mostly nights. The kind of shifts where you wait for calls in the dark, windshield fogged up, desert, air heavy, and still outside. The roads out by South Mountain are mostly empty at night, except for the occasional truck or someone dumb enough to be out hiking after dark. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I got the call to pick someone up at a gas station near the 202. I figured it was just a local trying to get home or catch a ride to the airport, but when I pulled up, The guy looked different, not in a bad way, just off. He was mid-40s, clean cut, wearing a black suit that didn't fit quite right, like it had been rented or thrifted. His hair was slicked back, and he had these dark sunglasses on, even though it was night. I rolled the window down, and he slid in the back without a word. "Where to?" I asked. He glanced out the window toward the desert and said, "Anywhere you can drive me where I can see the stars clearly. I saw something out there, something incredible." I raised an eyebrow but said, "South Mountain? I can get you a good view from up there." He nodded. As we drove, the radio static crackled low, almost like whispers behind the music. The desert outside was silent except for the occasional coyote howl. The guy didn't say much, just stared out the window. After about 20 minutes, we pulled over on a side road where the city lights faded and the sky opened up. He stepped out and stood beside the cab, looking up. "You ever see anything you couldn't explain?" he asked, voice low. I shrugged. "Not really, just stars and the usual night critters." He smiled briefly, then said, "I saw something tonight. Hovering over the rocks. No lights, no noise, just presence." Before I could ask more, he turned back to the cab. "Let's keep driving." We got back in, and he gave me a vague direction, deeper into the desert outskirts. The road was rougher here, less traveled. Halfway through, I glanced in the rearview mirror and realized he wasn't there anymore. The back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes and looked around. No sign of him anywhere. I called out his name, but only the wind answered. There were no footprints or any indication he'd been out there long enough to walk off. Feeling creeped out, I got back on the highway and started heading home. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Don't circle back." That's when I noticed the black SUV behind me, headlights dimmed, matching my speed perfectly. It stayed on my tail for miles, sometimes drifting just out of sight, sometimes close enough to see the darkened windows. I tried switching routes, taking side roads, but it followed. At one point, the SUV pulled alongside me, and the passenger window rolled down. A voice, calm and steady, said, "Don't circle back." Before I could respond, the window rolled up and the SUV accelerated away, disappearing into the night. I spent the rest of the shift driving straight to my apartment, checking the mirrors constantly, feeling watched. Since then, I haven't taken any rides out past the desert. The man in black never called or contacted me again, but every time I drive past South Mountain at night, I swear I catch a shadow in the corner of my eye, and I keep wondering what exactly I was shown that night, and why I was warned never to go back. I was out in the field late that night, just after the sun dipped below the horizon. It was early fall in southern Iowa, the kind of evening where the air starts to turn crisp, but the day's warmth still lingers in the soil. I had been checking the rows of corn. It's harvest season soon, and I'm picky about the way the stalks look. My grandpa's farm, been in the family for generations, and I like keeping it running right. I was standing near the old barn, the one built back in the 40s, when I noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was fireflies or maybe a trick of the light from the farmhouse windows, but then I saw 3 spheres, bright, glowing, and perfectly round, rising slowly from the roof of the barn. They were about the size of basketballs and had this eerie, steady light, not flickering or pulsing like a candle or anything natural. They hovered silently for maybe a minute, then drifted upward in unison, like balloons caught in a gentle breeze. But there was no sound, no wind, no change in the leaves around me. They just disappeared into the dark sky, as if someone switched off a light. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, thinking maybe I was imagining it, or maybe it was some kind of drone light show, but it was too quiet out here for anyone to be messing around. The farm is miles from the nearest town, and nobody comes around this late except me or the occasional raccoon. I stood there a while, feeling this weird mix of curiosity and unease. Then I went back to the house. I thought maybe I'd tell my wife, Lisa, but I figured she'd laugh it off. She's practical, not the type for weird stories, so I just kept it to myself. The next morning, I woke early and stepped outside to check the fields. It had been a clear night, so the dew was thick on the grass. As I walked toward the corn, I noticed a black pickup truck parked just inside the edge of my southern field. It wasn't one of the neighbors. No stickers, no plates I recognized. Two men got out, both wearing dark suits and white shirts, no ties, and polished black shoes that looked out of place in the muddy field. They didn't carry anything obvious, no clipboards or tools, just a couple of folding rulers they unfolded and started using to measure the spacing between rows of corn. I walked over, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" I asked. One of them looked up and gave me this blank, unreadable expression. "We're here about your planting," he said, voice calm but firm. "Planting?" I said, confused. "I plant what I've always planted. Corn's good for the soil." The other guy stepped forward and said, "Your rows are too irregular. You need to adjust your planting." I blinked, trying to process it. "I've been doing this for decades. The rows follow the land's slope. What exactly are you saying?" They looked at each other for a moment like they were expecting me to understand something I didn't. The first one said, "Precision matters. Patterns need correction for safety." I stared at them, feeling a cold kind of nervousness settle in. "Safety? What do you mean? Safety from what?" Neither answered. They just packed up their folding rulers, got back into the truck, and the black pickup pulled away slowly, leaving tire tracks in the soft dirt. I stood there for a minute, watching until the truck disappeared down the gravel road. For the rest of the day, I kept thinking about those glowing spheres and the two men measuring my crops. It felt like a weird dream, but the tire marks in the field were real, and my hands were still shaking when I touched the stalks. That night, I stayed inside and kept the porch light on, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The wind was still, but every time I glanced out the window, I thought I saw shadows moving just beyond the tree line. The next morning, I checked the field again. Some of the rows looked like they'd been flattened or pressed down, but there were no footprints, no signs of vehicles besides the truck tracks. The crops didn't look healthy in those spots, like something had sucked the life out of them. I called my cousin Dave, who helps me with the farm sometimes. I told him what happened. He laughed it off, said I was imagining things, probably tired from too much work. But I don't think I was. In the days that followed, strange things kept happening around the farm. The radio on the porch would buzz with static even when no one was using it. My dog, Buddy, started growling at empty patches of air and refusing to go near the barn. Sometimes, at night, I'd hear soft tapping noises against the windows. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there but empty fields and dark trees. I kept trying to ignore it, focused on the harvest, but the feeling didn't go away. Like something was out there, watching the rows of corn, waiting for me to change how I plant. One evening, I went out to the barn again, hoping to find some answer. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and wood. As I stepped inside, the shadows seemed deeper, almost swallowing the light from my flashlight. I didn't see the spheres this time, but I felt their absence like a weight. I started walking through the fields slowly, thinking about the men in black, their blank faces, and the way they said, "Adjust your planting." It sounded like a command, not advice. I don't know what they meant or what would have happened if I didn't listen. But the next morning, I found myself straightening out the rows a little more, trying to make them more uniform. It's been a couple weeks now. The strange noises and the shadows haven't gone away completely, but they're less intense. I keep an eye on the skies at night, hoping to see something, anything, to make sense of it all. But the truth is, I still don't know what's going on with those spheres or those men in black suits, and I'm not sure I want to. I was out in Joshua Tree for a couple days, just me and my camera. I'm a photographer, mostly landscapes and street scenes, but I've been meaning to do something different. Something that felt a little more off the grid. Desert murals caught my eye, especially the ones painted on those old concrete walls near the trails. They're weird, colorful, a little creepy sometimes. Perfect for a new project, or so I thought. I got there late afternoon, the sun still high but starting to dip. The air was dry and hot, but there was a cool breeze that stirred the dust around my boots. I set up near one of the murals, a big piece with strange shapes. human figures twisted into impossible angles, faces half hidden behind strange patterns. I figured I'd get some good shots with the fading sunlight, play with shadows. I started taking pictures, moving around to get different angles. Nothing felt unusual at first, but as the sun dropped lower, I noticed something that didn't make sense. There were shadows on the wall that didn't match anything casting them. I mean, you'd expect shadows to line up with trees or me moving around, but these shadows shifted and changed shape independently. Sometimes they'd stretch in one direction while the sun was clearly setting the opposite way. Sometimes a shadow would vanish entirely, even though the object it belonged to was right there. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe the texture of the wall messing with perspective. But I watched for nearly an hour, and the shadows kept moving on their own, bending and twisting like they had a life of their own. That's when I noticed him. I didn't see him at first because he was wearing a black suit. Nothing too fancy, but crisp and clean compared to the dusty desert around us. He was standing just off to the side, near the edge of the mural, watching me without saying a word. I froze for a second, then lowered my camera slowly. He stepped forward, calm and deliberate. I couldn't tell if he was in his 30s or 40s, but he had this weird, almost blank expression that didn't change. He looked down at my camera strap, the leather one with a few pins I'd attached, some from old shows, some just souvenirs, and ran his fingers over it without asking. Some frames aren't for the public eye, he said quietly, not quite a warning, not quite a threat. Then he turned and walked straight into the mural. I blinked, and I swear he just vanished into the painted figures on the wall, like stepping through a door that wasn't there. I stood there, camera hanging from my neck, trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light again, or some shadow play from the paint, but no way anyone has disappeared like that. I called out to him, but there was no answer, just the wind picking up dust. I checked behind the mural, around the rocks, anywhere I could think of, but there was no sign of him. That night, back at the small motel in town, I went through my photos. The shadows in the images looked normal, but when I zoomed in on some frames, I caught little glitches, parts of the shadow that looked like ripples or faint, flickering edges. I thought maybe my camera was messing up. I kept hearing this weird tapping noise from the motel window, but every time I looked, nothing was there. My phone had a few texts from unknown numbers, but they were just random strings of letters. I deleted them. The next day, I went back to the mural. The sun was hotter, the desert less forgiving. The black-suited man wasn't there, but I felt watched again. The shadows on the mural were still doing that weird thing, moving separately from the objects. That's when I saw footprints, 2 sets, perfectly pressed into the dirt. They led up to the mural, stopped, and then disappeared right at the wall, like whoever had walked them stepped into thin air. I followed the tracks back toward the highway, but nothing unusual was waiting there. Later that evening, as I packed up my gear, a car pulled up. Black, tinted windows, no plates. 2 men stepped out, also wearing suits, but theirs were more like business suits. No tie, white shirts, polished shoes. One of them walked up to me without a word, examined my camera strap like the first guy had, then looked me straight in the eye. "Be careful with what you capture," he said softly. "Not everything should be recorded." The other man scanned the mural silently, then they both got back in the car and left, tires kicking up dust. I felt like I'd crossed some invisible line. The desert suddenly seemed smaller, less open, like the murals weren't just paint on concrete, but gateways to something I couldn't understand. I drove home that night with the radio off, the road stretching empty in front of me. I've gone back to my usual work since then, but sometimes I find myself staring at shadows, wondering if they're really just shadows or if something else is moving inside them. I never shared those photos publicly. I don't know what's really out there behind the paint and the light, but I'm not sure I want to find out. I usually spend a lot of nights on the roof of my apartment building. It's nothing fancy, just an old bench, some leftover cushions, and my telescope set up to look at the stars. I like the quiet up there. The city noise is muffled, and the sky looks clearer than anywhere else around. I've been into amateur astronomy for years, so it's kind of my thing. This all started on a late September evening. The air was cool, a little crisp, but not cold yet. I'd gotten home from work early around 7 p.m., and after dinner, I hauled my scope up to the roof around 9:30. It was still mostly dark by then, but the stars were out, bright and sharp. I set the telescope to look at Cygnus, the Swan constellation. It's one of my favorites. I'd been tracking it for a while just to see how it moves through the night sky. Usually it shifts slowly, like everything else does, but this time something was off. When I lined up the scope, a star cluster in Cygnus moved, like it wasn't where it was supposed to be. At first I thought maybe I'd messed up the alignment or the coordinates. I double-checked my charts and my equipment, everything else was in place. The other constellations were exactly where they should be. But that part of Cygnus, a small group of stars near the tail, was shifted about 10 degrees to the west from where it was last time I checked. I stared at it for a while, blinking back and forth between my chart and the telescope's eyepiece. The stars themselves looked perfectly normal, steady, and bright, but the pattern was definitely wrong. I figured maybe it was a weird atmospheric thing or an optical illusion, so I stayed up watching for the next hour or so. The shifted cluster didn't move back. If anything, it stayed roughly in that position, almost like it was stuck. The next morning, I told my friend Leah about it. She's a geology student, not into astronomy, but she humored me. Maybe you're seeing a reflection or some kind of light pollution, she said, but I could tell she was curious. That night, I went back to the roof. It was cloudier than before, the kind of low-hanging fog that makes the city lights glow orange. I still set up the telescope, but I wasn't expecting to see much. About 11 p.m., I noticed a black sedan parked across the street, right under the building. It was just sitting there, engine off, no headlights on. The streetlight overhead barely lit it, but I could see a figure inside. I watched for maybe 10 minutes. The car didn't move. The figure didn't get out. At first I thought maybe it was just someone waiting or parking there for some reason. Then suddenly the passenger side door opened and a man stepped out. He was wearing a dark suit, black tie, black shirt, nothing flashy, and he moved in a way that felt deliberate, almost clinical, like he was on a job. I ducked behind the telescope, but I could see him looking up toward the building. He didn't climb the stairs or come inside. Instead, he pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and aimed it straight up at my telescope's lens. The light wasn't bright enough to blind me, but it caught the lens perfectly, reflecting a dull, greenish glow. I didn't know what to do. I froze for a second. He kept the flashlight aimed for maybe 20 seconds, then suddenly closed it and got back in the car. The door shut quietly. The engine started, and the sedan drove off slowly, disappearing down the street without a sound. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding, wondering if I should go down after him or call someone. But by the time I moved, the street was empty. The next few days were tense. I kept looking out my window, watching for that car or the man. Nothing. But I started feeling this weight, like I was being watched. I kept going up to the roof at night, but the stars didn't look right anymore. That shifted cluster in Cygnus was still off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the whole sky. One night, about a week later, I was packing up to leave the roof when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. I swear I heard someone whispering, but when I looked around, only the wind moved the leaves on the fire escape. I tried to ignore it, but the next day at work, my phone died unexpectedly. Battery at 100% the night before, suddenly dead in the middle of the afternoon. I replaced the battery, but it never held a full charge again. The weirdness kept piling up. Small things that didn't add up. My laptop crashed the next night. My neighbor told me his Wi-Fi had been acting strange. Flickering lights, weird static. I didn't tell anyone about the car or the man in the black suit. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't forget the way he looked at me from the street. The way the flashlight caught the telescope lens, like he wanted me to see it. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I see a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the roof, like someone is watching, but staying out of sight. And the stars, they don't feel like home anymore. I worked as a railway inspector for a small freight company out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Mostly my job was routine, checking cars for damage, verifying loads, making sure everything was up to spec. Ah, blank. Usually it was quiet, especially on the night shifts when the yard was nearly empty. The trains would come and go, mostly by themselves, with just a few people around. One night, I was doing a routine inspection of a long freight train parked on a siding near the edge of town. It was around 2 a.m., and the yard was dark except for a couple of floodlights. The air was cold, early October, just enough chill to feel it in your bones. I had my flashlight and my clipboard, walking alongside the cars, checking brakes and couplers. As I was moving between cars 23 and 24, I heard a weird noise. It was subtle at first, a metallic scraping sound coming from above, like something was dragging or rubbing against the side of the train, but high up, near the tops of the cars. I stopped and looked up, shining my flashlight, but the beam didn't catch anything. The yard lights weren't strong enough to illuminate above the cars fully, and the moon was behind some clouds. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dark shape moving quickly along the roof of the cars, almost too fast to be human. It wasn't a person, not really. The shape was low and stretched out like some kind of shadow or animal. It moved with a smooth, almost gliding motion. I blinked, and it was gone, like it melted into the darkness. My heart kicked up, but I told myself it had to be some animal. A raccoon or a large bird, maybe. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but nothing showed. I kept checking the cars, but the noise didn't happen again. I finished my inspection and headed to the small diner by the yard for breakfast. It was about 5 a.m., and the place was just opening up. The usual early crowd was there, truckers, railroad workers, and a few locals nursing coffee. I found a booth near the window and sat down, still a little shaken from the night. I ordered eggs and toast and tried to shake off the weird feeling. That's when I noticed him, a man sitting alone at the counter, watching me. He looked out of place. His suit was black, but it didn't fit right, like it was bought off the rack and never tailored. The collar was too tight, the sleeves a little short, his hair was slicked back, and his face was pale and expressionless. After a few minutes, he stood up and walked over to my table. I hadn't invited him, but he slid into the seat across from me without asking. 6 or 10 car lengths back? He asked quietly. I frowned. What? The shape you saw. 6 or 10 car lengths back from where you were. I shook my head. I don't know what you mean. I didn't catch a distance. It was just above the cars. He leaned forward slightly. The exact position matters. I stared at him, confused and a little uneasy. Who are you? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just someone keeping an eye on things. It's important you remember where it was. I tried to brush it off. Look, I'm just a rail inspector. I don't know anything about shapes on roofs or whatever this is. He nodded slowly, as if he expected me to say that. Still, you need to be careful. Before I could say anything else, he got up and walked out. No one else in the diner had noticed him, and when I looked back out the window, he was gone. No car, no footprints, nothing. I finished my breakfast and went back to the yard, but things didn't feel right. Over the next few days, I kept checking the spot he mentioned, but I never saw anything again. Sometimes I'd hear that faint scraping sound late at night, but it never repeated with that same strange pattern. I told a few coworkers, but they laughed it off. Said I must have been tired or imagining things. But I knew what I saw. The man's visit stuck with me, the way he spoke, the way he seemed to know what I was talking about without explaining anything. It was unsettling, and I kept wondering why he was so interested in the exact distance of that shape. I never saw him again, and I never figured out what was on those train roofs that night. It's just something that happened, left with questions I can't answer. I'd been working as a drone photographer for a little over a year, mostly doing industrial stuff, oil rigs, construction sites, that kind of thing. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I like the challenge of getting shots from angles people don't usually see. The rig I was working on that day was out off the coast of Louisiana, a platform surrounded by water and a few supply boats. Nothing weird about it, or so I thought. That evening, I had a client who wanted some twilight footage. The sun setting, the rig lights coming on. I launched my drone from the deck of a supply boat, flying it around the rig to get the shots they asked for. The weather was calm, a bit humid but warm, typical late summer night on the Gulf. I was about halfway through the shoot when I noticed something off to the northeast. At first, I thought it was just another supply boat, but the shape didn't look right. It was a rounded object hovering quietly above the water, not moving much. The drone's camera picked it up clearly, so I circled it to get better footage. The thing was about the size of a small helicopter, but it wasn't making any noise. No blinking lights, no visible engines or rotors. Just this smooth, dark, rounded shape hovering, reflecting the last light of sunset. It didn't seem to be doing anything, just hanging there. I kept filming for a few minutes, then decided to head back to the boat. As I brought the drone in, the object started to move slowly away, heading out over the open water, still quiet and smooth. Later that night, back at my small apartment in New Orleans, I was reviewing the footage on my laptop. The object was clear, perfectly in focus against the dim sky and water. It didn't look like any kind of aircraft I knew, but I kept second-guessing myself. Maybe some kind of experimental drone? A weather balloon? I wasn't sure. Around 2 a.m., there was a knock at my door. That was weird because I don't get visitors at that hour. When I opened it, a man was standing there. He was maybe mid-30s, wearing a black vest over a plain black shirt, dark pants, no badge, no name tag. Just stood there, looking at me with this calm, steady gaze. "Mr. Carter?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, still half asleep and confused. He didn't introduce himself, just said, "We need you to delete the footage you took tonight, for everyone's safety." I blinked, trying to figure out if this was a joke or something serious. "Who are you? What footage?" He didn't answer the first question. "That object you filmed above the rig, it can't be shared. Delete it." I felt this knot in my stomach. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about exactly, but I'm a contractor. I don't want any trouble. Can you tell me who you work for?" He shook his head. "No one you need to know. Just delete the files. Now." I hesitated. I didn't like being ordered around, but the guy's tone was firm, and there was something off about him, like he wasn't used to being refused. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll delete it, but can I at least have something in writing?" He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "That won't be necessary. We trust you'll do the right thing." He turned and walked away down the hallway, leaving me standing there with my laptop open on the dining table. I stared at the screen for a long time. The footage was still there, the last moments of twilight, the rig lights glowing, and that strange object just hovering. I could hear the hum of my hard drive, the quiet of my apartment. I thought about calling someone, the police maybe, but what would I say? Some guy in black showed up demanding I delete video of a rounded object over an oil rig. I felt the walls closing in a bit. I decided to back up the footage first, just in case, onto a flash drive and hid it in a drawer. The next day, I called the rig's security office. They said there was nothing unusual reported that night. The supervisor told me that they'd been doing regular maintenance and no strange objects had been seen. I kept thinking about that man in black. He didn't look like security, no badge, no ID. When I asked around at the rig later, nobody recognized anyone fitting his description. In the days that followed, I noticed people watching me at the drone meetups and gigs. Not openly, just enough to make me nervous. Phones seemed to be out of battery when I was trying to upload anything remotely related to the rig. Files got corrupted, computers acted up. I kept the footage hidden and stopped talking about the incident. I don't know if that guy was some private security or government or something else, but there was definitely something they didn't want me to have. I never saw him again, and the strange object never appeared in the footage after that night. I still fly drones, but I stay clear of that rig now. I've been tracking wildlife in the Pacific Northwest for almost 10 years now, mostly deer, elk, and the usual forest critters. It's a job that requires a lot of patience, paying attention to subtle signs, broken twigs, hoof prints, scat, anything that tells you an animal passed through. I'm used to the quiet and the isolation. It's just me, the forest, and whatever's moving through it. A couple weeks ago, I was out on a routine walk following a trail I'd been monitoring for deer activity. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that presses down on everything, making the forest feel heavier. It had rained the day before, so the ground was soft and muddy in places. About an hour into the hike, I came across something strange. A perfect circle, maybe 10 feet across, in the middle of a clearing. The grass and underbrush inside the circle were completely flattened, pressed down as if something heavy had sat there for a while. What made it odd was the edges. The border was sharp, like someone took a giant cookie cutter to the ground. The circle was completely clear of any leaves or branches sticking up. I knelt down and started looking for tracks. Usually an animal or group of animals would leave some kind of trail leading in or out, but this time there was nothing. No prints, no drag marks, no broken twigs. The mud around the circle looked untouched, like whatever had been there had somehow appeared out of nowhere and disappeared the same way. I circled around a couple times, scanning the edges for any sign of disturbance beyond the circle. The trees and bushes outside were normal, some snapped branches here and there, but nothing out of the ordinary for a forest path. It didn't make any sense. Usually, if deer or elk bed down, they leave tracks, scrape the ground, or flatten a rough patch. But this was too precise, too clean, like someone or something had sat there but didn't walk in or out. I pulled out my phone to snap some photos. I wanted to show them to a couple friends who track animals too, see if maybe they'd seen anything like it. While I was kneeling, I heard a twig snap behind me. I looked up fast. About 30 feet into the trees, two men stepped out onto the trail. They were wearing black suits, the kind you'd expect from a business meeting, but they didn't have ties or anything casual. Their clothes looked stiff and they didn't seem to be dressed for hiking. Both had short, dark hair, clean-shaven, and serious expressions. I didn't say anything at first. They didn't either. They just walked slowly toward the circle. One of them bent down and started counting something along the edge, pointing silently at different spots on the ground. The other just stood there, watching. Neither looked at me. I didn't want to speak up, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to say. They counted around the circle a few times, always without talking. Then, without a word, they turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I stayed frozen for a few minutes, trying to figure out if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the circle was still there, and my phone was in my hand with the pictures I'd taken. When I got home, I tried to look up if anyone had reported anything similar in the area. Nothing. No local news, no hiking forums, no wildlife blogs, and anything like a perfect circle or strange men in black suits. That night, I kept thinking about the circle and the way those two men had just appeared and vanished. Like they were connected to it somehow, but I couldn't explain how. The next morning, I went back to the spot, hoping maybe I'd find more clues. The circle was still there, but something had changed. The ground inside looked drier, less pressed down. Like the forest was slowly trying to erase whatever had been done. I stayed a while, watching for any animals, but the usual deer and squirrels kept their distance. I felt watched, like I wasn't alone, even though I didn't see anyone. Over the next few days, I noticed small things off around the woods near my house. Footsteps that stopped abruptly, a car parked a block away that I didn't recognize, shadows that flickered just at the edge of my vision. I kept telling myself it was my imagination or normal forest stuff, but I'm not sure anymore. Whatever that circle was, and whoever those men were, they left a mark I can't explain. And now, I feel like the forest isn't just home to animals anymore. I was out at the burned field before dawn, trying to get a head start on the morning patrol. The fire from a week ago had left that patch of land a mess. Charred, blackened dirt with brittle stalks poking out like broken bones. The whole place still smelled faintly of smoke, even though the rain last night had tried to wash it away. The fog was thick that morning, so thick I could barely see past 20 feet. It was one of those silvery, damp mornings where everything feels muffled. I like those mornings sometimes. Quiet, no distractions. I was standing by the edge of the field, scanning the perimeter with my binoculars, just making sure nothing was smoldering or about to flare up again. We get called in pretty often for that. The fire might be out, but the ground stays hot in spots, and sometimes the wind picks up embers. That's when I noticed it. At first, it looked like nothing. Just a shadow moving above the field. It wasn't moving like a bird or a plane. It was just there. I blinked, and the shadow took shape, a triangular form, dark against the pale gray fog, hovering maybe 30 feet off the ground. It wasn't making a sound, no engine noise, no wind rush, just hanging in the mist like it belonged there. I froze for a minute, trying to convince myself it was some kind of weather balloon or a drone. But nothing about it made sense. No blinking lights, no propellers or wings. Then it moved. Slowly at first, just shifting sideways over the burnt field. Then it disappeared as silently and suddenly as it had appeared, like it melted back into the fog. I was standing there, dumbfounded for a while. The fog started to thin as the sun rose, and the field looked the same as always, charred and quiet. I kept telling myself I must have imagined it. Morning haze, playing tricks. But the feeling in my gut said otherwise. Later that afternoon, back at the firehouse, I was still rattled. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a coffee and flipping through some reports when the door opened, and in walked a man. He was wearing a black suit, no tie, perfectly pressed shirt, shoes that looked polished even though this was a dusty place. His hair was dark, slicked back, and his face was sharp but kind of empty, like he was studying me without actually seeing me. "Afternoon," he said, voice calm but low. He didn't introduce himself or say why he was there. I was about to ask when he walked over to the window, looked out toward the burned field. Then, without moving toward it, he leaned in like he was inspecting something. He didn't touch anything, but he looked carefully at the scorch marks on the ground visible from the firehouse's vantage point. Then he turned back to me. "We appreciate your discretion," he said, his eyes locking with mine. I wanted to ask who he was, why he was here, but something about his presence made it hard to speak. I just nodded. He stayed another few minutes, looking around the room as if seeing everything for the first time. Then, without another word, he left. After he was gone, I kept thinking about that triangular shape in the fog and the way this guy had appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as quietly. I haven't told many people. It felt like something that shouldn't be talked about. Maybe I was being watched, after all. Since then, I avoid that field when the fog rolls in, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear a low hum, like something just beyond the edge of hearing. I don't know what I saw, and I don't know who that man was, but I'm sure it wasn't just a coincidence. I was camping alone one weekend in the San Juan Mountains, somewhere near Lake San Cristobal. It was early September, and the nights were already getting cold, but the days still felt warm. I'd gone out for some solitude, wanted to get away from everything for a couple of days. No phone signal, no internet, just the woods and the lake. The first night was pretty uneventful. I set up camp near the water's edge, right on a little flat spot with a decent view of the lake and the mountains beyond. I brought my old camera, mostly to snap pictures of the scenery and wildlife. I like taking photos, but I'm not a professional or anything, just a hobby. That night, I was sitting by the fire after dinner, just fiddling with the camera when something caught my eye. Across the lake, near the far tree line, there was this faint streak of green light. It wasn't like lightning or a firefly or anything I'd seen before. It shot down from the sky in a clean, straight line and disappeared just at the water's edge. No sound, just that quick flash of green. I grabbed my camera, switched it to manual, and snapped a few shots, trying to get a clear picture of the streak. It was almost like a slow-moving meteor, but the color was off, and it didn't burn out or break apart. I stared for a while, but nothing else showed up, so I went back to the fire and tried to forget it. I didn't think much of it in the moment, just some weird light in the sky. I packed up the camera and called it a night. The next morning, I woke up to fog hanging low over the lake, everything damp and quiet. I was still half asleep when I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves behind my tent. I froze, grabbed my flashlight, and poked my head out. There was a man standing near my cooler, just looking down at it. He wore a black suit, like a full suit and tie, which felt totally out of place in the woods. His hair was slicked back and his face was pale and unreadable. I'd never seen anyone camp out here dressed like that. "Morning," he said, voice low and calm. Hey," I said, rubbing my eyes. He didn't smile. Instead, he kicked my cooler to the side with his shoe. This area is under new management," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked, standing up and moving closer, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me like he was waiting for me to get the message. Then he said, "We're here to make sure no unauthorized activity takes place." I glanced down at my stuff. The cooler was tipped over, spilling some cans and a half-empty bottle of water onto the dirt. I felt my stomach tighten. Authorized by who? He didn't say. Instead, he pulled out a small card from his jacket and held it up. The card had a seal, something official looking, but I couldn't make out the details in the dim light. "We monitor this region for safety," he said, then took a step back. I wanted to ask more, but my voice caught in my throat. The whole thing felt surreal. The way he moved, the way he said those words without explaining anything. It was like he was telling me something important without actually saying it. I packed up my camp faster than planned, trying not to look at him too much. As I walked down the trail, I glanced back, but he was gone. On the hike back to my car, I kept checking my camera. The photos from the night before showed the green streak clearly, a smooth, sharp line, almost glowing. But when I zoomed in, there was something strange. The area where the streak hit the lake looked darker, like a shadow or a void in the water. No ripples, no splash, nothing you'd expect if something had fallen in. I asked around later, at a small diner in town, if anyone had seen anything strange near the lake. A few locals shrugged it off, saying weird lights happen sometimes in mountains, maybe some kind of ball lightning or gas. But no one talked about anyone in suits or new management. When I got home, I checked the news. No reports of crashes, no searches, no missing hikers. The lake was just the same as always. I've been back to that area a few times since, but I haven't seen the man in black again. And I don't know what that green light was or why someone would come out here to tell me the lake was under new management. It's just a quiet spot, surrounded by trees and mountains, but something about that night and that morning didn't fit. Like the place wasn't quite the same anymore, even if nothing else had changed. I was volunteering that summer at Cedar Hollow Park, the kind of place where the woods run deep and the city noise fades away completely. I'd done trail maintenance and visitor help for a few months, mostly early mornings and late afternoons. That week, I was on the night shift, helping the rangers close up the station after dark, just keeping an eye on things and making sure no one wandered off the trails after hours. The night I'm talking about was clear and cold, the kind where the moon hangs bright and sharp, throwing long shadows through the trees. I had stayed late at the station to finish some paperwork after the last group left around 11 p.m. The whole park was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the far-off call of an owl. I decided to take a quick walk before locking up, just to stretch my legs. I headed down one of the lesser-used trails that ran along the edge of the park, near the old oak grove. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, and the moonlight filtered through the branches in thin, pale strips. That's when I saw it. A smooth, almost perfect shape drifting silently between the trees. It caught the moonlight so sharply it looked like a mirror floating just above the ground, reflecting everything around it. The branches, the sky, the faint glow of the moon itself. I stopped dead, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't moving like an animal or anything I'd ever seen. No wings, no legs, just sliding slowly, smoothly, like it was gliding on some invisible current. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but it stayed there for maybe 20 seconds, just drifting between the trees, before disappearing deeper into the shadows. I thought maybe it was some kind of weird piece of trash, a shiny tarp or a sign blown loose, but nothing moved or flapped in the wind. It was completely silent and steady, like it was alive, but cautious. I pulled out my phone, but when I looked back, it was gone. No trace. No trace. I called out softly, but the woods swallowed the sound. I didn't want to follow it. Instead, I headed back to the station, feeling a little on edge, but telling myself I was probably just tired and seeing things. The rest of the night was uneventful. I locked up, checked the gates, and turned off the lights. But as I was about to leave, I noticed headlights cutting through the trees at the far end of the parking lot. A black SUV rolled up slowly, stopping right near the ranger station. The windows were darkly tinted and there was no visible license plate. The engine was quiet, almost too quiet for a vehicle that size. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He wore a black suit, nothing fancy but pressed and neat. His shirt was white and his tie was perfectly straight. He looked clean-shaven, but there was something off about him, like he didn't quite belong in that place or time. He walked over without a word and stopped right at the door. His eyes scanned the station for a moment before settling on me. "You volunteer here?" he asked, voice calm but low. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, though I was still keyed up from what I'd seen earlier. "Just finishing up for the night." He nodded slowly, then pulled out a badge of some kind. It wasn't official looking, no government seal or emblem, just a plain metal rectangle with a few letters I didn't recognize. "I'm with a special agency," he said. "We're taking over operations in this area." I raised an eyebrow. "Taking over?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Effective immediately. You're to file your reports elsewhere." I blinked, not sure how to respond. "My reports? What reports?" He tapped a folder under his arm. "Anything unusual you've encountered? Any observations, sightings, or incidents?" I swallowed. "I haven't had anything like that." He nodded like he expected me to say that. "Good. Then there should be no problem." The whole thing felt strange, too formal, too rehearsed, like a scene from a movie. I wanted to ask more, but got the impression he wasn't here to chat. He glanced back at the SUV, then turned to me again. "Stay clear of the old oak grove at night," he said. "No more volunteers allowed past closing hours." Before I could answer, he walked back to his vehicle, slid in, and the SUV disappeared down the road, leaving me standing in the empty lot under the cold moonlight. The next day, I went back to the park office to find all the usual paperwork gone. Nothing on the desks, no files in the cabinets. The rangers, who usually worked there, acted like nothing was different. But the old oak grove was blocked off with new signs. Restricted area, no entry after dark. I didn't tell anyone about the mirrored object or the man in black. Honestly, it felt like I wouldn't be believed. But the whole time, I kept wondering what exactly he meant by filing reports elsewhere, and what they were so interested in hiding out there in the trees. Sometimes when I'm out walking at night now, I catch myself looking toward the oak grove, half expecting to see that strange silver shape again, drifting silently through the branches. But it never shows, and I'm left wondering if it ever really was there at all. I was working the night shift on the highway crew out near Cedar Creek, just outside of town. It was late spring, but the nights were still chilly, and the sky was mostly clear, with a thin layer of clouds drifting low enough to blur the stars. We were fixing a stretch of road that had been cracked by frost, and the bright floodlights on our truck lit up the site like a small day in the middle of the night. Our crew was just 4 of us, me, Jay, Marcus, and the foreman, Steve. We'd been rotating shifts for weeks, so this wasn't anything new. Usually the night shifts felt dull, just the sound of jackhammers and the hum of the lights, but that night, something felt off. We were halfway through the job when I noticed it first. There was this shadow that moved fast, way above us, passing over the lights. It wasn't like any bird or plane I'd ever seen. It was disc-shaped, or at least close to it, and completely silent. I pointed it out to Jay, and he saw it too. He's the skeptic in our group, but even he stopped mid-sentence to watch it drift across the sky. It disappeared behind the trees on the far side of the road. We joked about it for a bit, saying maybe it was some weird kind of drone, but none of us had ever heard of anything like that in these parts. We went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around 2 a.m., the air got colder, and the clouds thickened. I was stacking cones near the edge of the road when headlights appeared through the fog, cutting straight through the mist. A black rental pickup pulled up slowly and stopped near our equipment truck. Steve walked over, squinting through the fog. A man got out of the truck. He was dressed in a black suit, but it was weird. The fabric looked too stiff and perfect, like it was brand new but somehow matte, not shiny. His shoes made no noise on the gravel, and he didn't say anything at first, just stared at us. Then he pulled out this small handheld scanner and waved it over our helmets, like he was checking for something. It beeped quietly a couple of times when it scanned me and then the others. "Your shift's moved," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "Pack up." Steve frowned. "Moved? Where?" "No longer your jurisdiction," the man said, folding the scanner away. He looked around like he was expecting someone, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Orders come down, effective immediately." Steve took the paper, unfolded it. I could barely make out the words, but the top said Cedar Creek Project, and there was a big red stamp that said confidential. The rest was hard to read in the dim light, but it mentioned a temporary halt and reassignment to a different location, nowhere familiar. I asked the guy, "Who sent you?" He just looked at me for a long second, like I wasn't supposed to be there. "You won't get any more details. You'll receive new instructions." Then he turned and walked back to the truck, engine running before he even sat down. The headlights blinked once, and the truck disappeared into the fog just as suddenly as it had come. We all stood there, silent. Steve looked at the paper again and then crushed it in his hand. Jay broke the silence. "That's the weirdest shit I've seen on any shift." Marcus nodded. "You sure that wasn't some kind of prank?" I wasn't so sure. The guy had that odd way of moving, like he didn't quite belong there. His eyes were too cold, and the scanner thing? I'd never seen equipment like that on any job site. We started packing up, but something didn't feel right. As we loaded the tools, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those lights or that shadow again. But the night stayed quiet. When we left, the road behind us was empty, like nothing had happened. The next day, no one mentioned the shift change. Steve called the dispatcher, but they said the schedule hadn't been updated and the project was still on. We tried to get back that night, but the gate to the worksite was locked. The official signs had changed too. New notices that weren't there before, warning about restricted access for safety reasons. The whole area felt sealed off, but no one could tell us why. Weeks later, I ran into a former coworker who works at the county office. I asked if he'd heard anything about Cedar Creek. He hesitated, then said, "Some people noticed strange lights out there, but nothing official. The whole thing's hush-hush now." That's all I got. I don't know what the shadow was or who that suited guy really worked for. But I know our shift ended that night, whether the paper said so or not. The whole thing just hangs there, like something you half see out of the corner of your eye, but when you look straight on, it's gone. I was working a midweek shift in the forest, about 30 miles outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. My name's Carl Jensen. I do forestry work for the state, mainly monitoring tree health, checking for disease or insect infestations, and sometimes setting up equipment to measure environmental conditions like humidity and soil moisture. The area I was in that day was a section of ponderosa pines that had been off limits for a while due to wildfire risk, so it was quiet and mostly untouched. It was early morning, cool and clear, with a slight breeze that rattled the pine needles overhead. I was hiking out to a site to check on a few sensors I'd installed a few weeks earlier. Around 9 a.m., I noticed this low, vibrating hum in the air. It wasn't like any machine I'd ever heard, too deep and steady, almost like the sound of a huge engine idling far off, but I couldn't see anything. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out what was causing it. The hum seemed to come from just beyond a cluster of trees, maybe 50 yards away. Then, without warning, this smooth, dark shape slipped silently between the trunks. I say shape because I couldn't make out any clear form. No edges, no seams, just this black mass, perfectly smooth and almost reflective in the patches of sunlight that filtered through the canopy. It moved with a fluid grace, like it was gliding rather than walking or rolling. It disappeared behind a thick stand of pines and didn't come back out. I wasn't sure what to think. Part of me wanted to follow it, but another part warned me not to. The forest was too quiet otherwise, and the usual sounds of birds and wind seemed muted, like the whole place was holding its breath. I shook my head and kept moving toward the sensors. The rest of the morning was uneventful. I did my rounds, tested the equipment, and noted the readings. But I couldn't stop thinking about that dark shape. By noon, I was back at the ranger station for lunch. It's a small, plain building with a break room where the forestry workers hang out. I was eating my sandwich and sipping coffee when a man walked in. He looked out of place, clean-shaven, with short black hair slicked back, wearing a black uniform that didn't have any patches or logos. No name tag, no badge. Just a plain black shirt and pants, the kind of outfit you'd expect from security personnel or government agents, but not someone you'd usually see around a forestry office. He sat down at my table without asking, which threw me off. I glanced at him, half expecting someone to come get him or say something, but no one else seemed to notice. He looked at my gear, lying on the table, my GPS, a handheld weather meter, and some other measuring tools. Then he asked, in a quiet but firm voice, equipment calibration. Are your instruments within acceptable parameters? I blinked, confused. Yeah, I think so. Everything checks out so far. Why? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned in a bit and said, it's important to maintain accuracy. Deviations can lead to unintended consequences. Before I could ask what he meant, he stood up and walked out of the room. I turned to grab my coffee, but when I looked back, he was gone. No sign he'd ever been there. The rest of the afternoon felt strange. I kept noticing little things out of place. My GPS showed tiny jumps in my position, like I'd briefly moved a few dozen feet in a blink. The weather meter fluctuated erratically for no reason. And there was that deep hum again, faint this time, somewhere just beyond the tree line. On my way back to the truck, I caught a glimpse of that dark shape again. It was sitting on a rock, perfectly still, almost blending into the shadows. When it saw me looking, it vanished into the trees. I didn't say anything to the other forestry workers about the man in black or the shape. I wasn't sure what to make of it myself. But since that day, I've noticed strange lights flickering between the pines at night, and sometimes that low hum returns, even when no equipment is running nearby. I keep wondering if the man was warning me or checking on something I wasn't supposed to see. Whatever it was, I don't think this forest is as ordinary as it seems. The dawn was still fragile when I noticed it. This weird streak of light cutting across the sky, way too fast and straight for any plane or bird. I was unlocking the back door of the clinic where I work as a wildlife rehabilitator out here in rural Vermont. It was one of those mornings where everything felt half asleep, the sky just starting to lighten and the air thick with moisture from last night's rain. I stopped dead in my tracks, eyes locked on that streak. It was bright, almost blinding for a second, and it moved so cleanly across the horizon like someone had dragged a glowing ruler across the sky. No tail, no blinking lights, no noise, nothing. Just that sharp line, cutting through the morning like it didn't belong. I shook my head, thinking maybe I was still groggy, but something about it stayed with me as I headed inside. The clinic was quiet. I usually get in early to check on the nocturnal animals, owls, bats, some raccoons that come in injured or orphaned. When I went to the cage room, I noticed right away that something was wrong. Every single cage door was open. That didn't make sense. I'm pretty meticulous about closing those doors every night before I leave. And it's not like the animals just let themselves out. I hadn't heard any noise during the night, no rustling or barking or fluttering. I walked through the room, heart starting to beat faster. All the animals were still there, huddled or sitting quietly inside. No signs of damage or struggle. The doors were just open, and not a single one was locked. I checked the security cameras later that morning, hoping to find some explanation. A raccoon clever enough to work a latch, or maybe a door left ajar by accident. But the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. No movement near the cage room at all during the night. I tried calling the other staff, but it was too early for anyone to answer. I didn't want to freak anyone out, so I just locked everything back up and went about my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That evening I was locking up when I saw him, standing just outside the front door of the clinic, in a black suit that looked like it had come straight out of the 1950s. The jacket was tight, the tie perfectly knotted, and his shoes shined almost too much for this little rural town. He didn't say anything when I stepped outside, just held out a key ring toward me. There was a small white tag attached to it with neat printed letters that said, "Do not use." I stared at him, dumbfounded. No expression on his face, no indication of who he was or why he was here. I asked him who he was or what this was about, but he just shook his head slowly and then turned on his heel and walked away down the empty street, disappearing into the gathering dusk. I was left standing there with the keys in my hand, the "Do Not Use" label glaring up at me under the streetlight. I didn't know what to do with them. I still don't. The next morning, everything at the clinic was normal. No open cages, no missing animals. But sometimes when the light is just right at dawn, I swear I see something moving outside. Just a shadow, or maybe a figure in a black suit watching from the edge of the trees. And the key ring? It's sitting on my kitchen table. I haven't touched it since that night. I was out on the edge of town one evening chasing storms. My name's Lena Ortiz, and I'm a photographer who's been obsessed with capturing lightning for a few years now. It's kind of a niche thing, but there's something about that raw energy cutting through the sky that just pulls me in. That night was humid and still, right before a thunderstorm finally rolled in over the power lines that run just outside the city limits. I had set up near a dirt road where the pylons stretch in a long line across an open field. It's a spot I'd been to before, but that night something felt off. The air was thick, like you could cut it with a knife, and there was this strange quiet. No crickets, no wind rustling the grass, just this heavy silence. I was watching the clouds darken, camera ready, waiting for a good strike. Then, suddenly, a bolt lit up the sky, sharp and close, and I snapped a photo. I lowered the camera, expecting to check the shot and wait for the next strike, but something caught my eye. Between two of the pylons, there was this dark shape, almost like a silhouette, flickering in and out of view for just a second. It was perfectly round, like a disc, but it wasn't glowing or flashing, just there, shifting like a shadow, slipping between the metal towers. I blinked, tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light or some kind of bird or drone. I looked back at my camera screen and zoomed in on the photo I'd just taken. There it was. Faint, but clear enough, a round shape hovering near the power lines just off-center. The lightning had illuminated it, and it looked like it was solid, not a reflection or lens flare. I felt my heart skip a beat, but convinced myself it was probably some weather balloon or a weird camera artifact. I packed up and left the spot once the storm passed, but I kept going back to that photo over the next couple of days. 2 days later, I was at a small cafe downtown, editing photos on my laptop. The place wasn't busy, just a few regulars. I was alone in a corner when a man in a black suit came in. Not a flashy or expensive-looking suit, just plain black, and he didn't have a tie or anything. He walked over to my table without saying a word and sat down opposite me. I looked up, startled. "I see you've been photographing the storm near the pylons," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but had this strange intensity that made me uncomfortable. I nodded, trying to figure out if this was some kind of weird joke or maybe a reporter. "May I?" he asked, and before I could say no, he reached out and grabbed my laptop. He pulled up the photo with the dark disk in it. He printed a black and white copy right there on the cafe's printer. I hadn't even noticed he was carrying a small portable printer in his briefcase. He slid the print across the table to me. "If you decide to share this image, consider framing it differently," he said, eyes locked on mine. I was too confused to respond. "What do you mean?" He smiled thinly, stood up, and walked away. Just like that, he was gone. I looked down at the print. The disc-shaped silhouette was even more visible in black and white, but this time I noticed something else. Subtle distortions around it, like the air was bending or shimmering. After that, things got weirder. My phone started acting up. Calls would drop without explanation. My GPS would glitch, showing me in places I hadn't been. I began noticing people watching me, just out of the corner of my eye, men in plain black clothes blending into crowds. They never approached, but their presence was unmistakable. One night, I went out again to photograph lightning, hoping to catch another shot or maybe understand what I'd seen. The storm was rolling in, and the wind had picked up. I set up my camera and waited. Lightning flashed, and for a moment, I thought I saw that disc again, flickering just beyond the pylons. But when I raised my camera, it was gone. I left quicker than usual and got back home feeling tense. The next morning, I found a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a Polaroid, an instant photo of my apartment window taken from the outside. The image was grainy, but I could make out my reflection in the glass, and behind me, just a faint shadow that looked like a man in a suit. There was no note, just the photo. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched only grew. I stopped sharing any photos of the storm. I deleted the images from my camera and phone. Yet, I kept wondering who that man was and why he cared about the photo. What did he want me to frame differently? Weeks went by and the men in black never directly confronted me again, but I could feel their eyes whenever I stepped outside. The strange glitches persisted. I kept shooting storms, always hoping to catch a glimpse of the disc or figure out what it was, but it never appeared again. I guess some things don't want to be seen, and some pictures aren't meant to be shared as they are. The storm hit hard that night. I was alone in the lighthouse on Cape Elmore, the rain hammering against the windows and the wind howling like it wanted to rip the whole place off its foundation. I'm Jack Mullins, been the keeper here for 5 years now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and I like the solitude most of the time. That evening started like any other during a storm. I was sitting in the small kitchen area, watching the waves crash under the lighthouse, jotting down notes in the logbook about wind speeds and visibility. The radio was crackling with static, just the usual weather reports. Around midnight, when the storm was at its worst, I stepped out onto the balcony for a quick check. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow out over the water, bobbing with the motion of the waves. But it didn't look like any boat or buoy. The light was too steady, too. Intentional. It dipped beneath the waves, then popped back up, almost like it was swimming. I blinked, thinking maybe the storm was messing with my eyes. But the glow stayed there, moving slowly, almost deliberately. It wasn't random. The way it disappeared beneath the surface and resurfaced felt purposeful, like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. I didn't hear any engines or see any silhouette, just that soft, eerie glow pulsing in the dark, stormy sea. I wanted to call it in, but the radio was acting up. When I tried to make a call, all I got was that scratchy static again. No answer. I stood there for a long time watching that light dip and rise with the waves until it slowly faded away as the storm started to let up near dawn. The next day was calm. Clear skies, the kind of morning where the ocean looks almost peaceful after a night like that. I went about my usual routine, checking the equipment, cleaning lenses, recording the storm details in my logbook. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in this weather. When I opened it, 2 men were standing there. Black suits, black ties, and those shiny shoes you see in movies. They looked like they just stepped out of some 1950s detective film. They didn't introduce themselves. One of them held up my logbook. The other didn't say anything, but just stared at me for a moment. They flipped through the pages slowly, then circled a few dates in red ink, including last night's entry about the glowing orb. "You're advised to exercise discretion," the man holding the book said quietly. His voice was calm but firm, like he expected me to understand the weight behind the words. I asked them what they meant, what was going on, but they just looked at each other briefly before the other man added, "Some nights are better left unrecorded." Then they handed the logbook back to me and walked off without another word, disappearing down the gravel path toward the main road like they'd never been there. I stared after them, the feeling of unease growing in my chest. I flipped through the logbook again. The red circles were deliberate, almost clinical, marking more than just the recent storm. Other strange entries from weeks and months before, things I'd thought were odd but wrote off. Since then, I keep finding small things out of place. The radio crackling with static at weird times, brief glimpses of light out at sea, strange shadows flickering across the walls. But every time I think about bringing it up, I remember those men and their warning. I keep writing in the logbook, but I skip those marked nights now. Some things are just better left unrecorded. It was 1994. I was stationed at Nellis, but working a temporary assignment out at the Tonopah Test Range. I just turned 38. Back then, I was a radar technician, E6, 17 years in. Mostly maintenance and diagnostics, but occasionally I'd sit in and monitor during late-night flights if they needed extra eyes on a scope. Most of the time, it was dead quiet. This happened on a Tuesday, sometime in October. I remember because the weather had just started to cool off at night, and that week we'd been told to expect some classified testing near Groom. That wasn't unusual. They'd route certain aircraft through Tonopah's radar coverage for tracking, and we weren't supposed to ask questions about what exactly we were looking at, just log and report. Black project stuff. You learn not to get curious. That night, I was in the radar control van with a guy named Daniels. He was new to the site, came from Edwards, I think, and still getting familiar with the setup. We were running a standard systems test around 0200, just verifying sweep ranges and checking for ghost returns. I was about halfway through logging the last check when I saw it. A single return blinked onto the screen, right on the edge of the Groom Lake airspace. No transponder. Altitude read 30,000 feet. At first, I figured it was a glitch. Happens sometimes when the scope gets hot, especially during long sweeps. But before I could reset it, the blip moved. Instantly. No delay, no descent arc, just one sweep it was at 30,000 feet, the next it was showing 0. Ground level, right in the middle of restricted airspace. Daniels leaned over and frowned. "Was that a skip?" I said. "I don't think so," and backed up the sweep log. It wasn't a radar skip. The return had weight, signature depth, Doppler reading, the whole thing. Not noise, not a bird, not a cloud, it had structure. Then it was gone. Just blinked off the scope like it had never been there. We ran a systems check. Nothing came up out of spec. The diagnostics were clean, power stable, no magnetic interference. I pulled the signal log from the previous 30 minutes and ran it again on playback. Same thing. One clean hit at high altitude, then immediate drop to ground, then nothing. Daniels didn't say anything for a while. Just sat back in the chair watching the blank screen. We called it in, low-level priority. Logged it as a transient anomaly, no flight plan associated. The next morning, 2 civilian contractors came in, both in suits, both with restricted credentials. One of them, older guy, salt and pepper hair, no name badge, asked me to walk him through what I saw. I gave him the rundown, showed him the printouts. He didn't look surprised, didn't even ask many questions. Just nodded and said, "That's consistent," like it was something they'd seen before. Then he asked me to delete the signal logs. I told him I couldn't do that without an order. He handed me a form already filled out and signed. Department of Defense, red header, authorization code. I deleted the logs. Later that week, the same radar van was taken offline for calibration. When it came back online, the memory storage had been swapped, and all signal archives from that night were gone. I didn't say anything after that. I knew better. But that wasn't the end of it. 3 nights later, I was walking between the van and the comms building around 300. It was cold, maybe low 40s, and dead quiet. The kind of quiet that buzzes in your ears. No wind, no bugs, just stillness. I looked out past the perimeter fence toward the south end of the range, where Groom Lake airspace technically begins. There was a light, bright white, just hovering maybe half a mile off the ground. No blinking, no movement, just there. It wasn't a plane. We had flight bands in place during that window. I stood there maybe 20 seconds before it started rising, slowly, vertically, no sound. Then it disappeared. Not faded, not flew away, just gone. Next morning, Daniels handed me a sealed envelope. No name on it, just my clearance level. Inside was a short memo stating my assignment at Tonopah had ended early, effective immediately, and I was being rotated back to Nellis. No reason given. I packed up that afternoon. I didn't see Daniels again after that. Don't know if he stayed or got moved too. Years later, long after I retired, I requested my service records just out of curiosity. The Tonopah assignment was listed, but the radar logs for that week were missing. Whole stretch blacked out. I still remember the way that blip dropped. 30,000 feet to 0 in less than a second. No arc, no trail. Just there then not. I've never seen anything like it before or since.